The world had shrunk, its once boundless horizons contracting with each passing day, with each fresh fall of snow, until it was defined by the meager circumference of the flickering firelight that battled vainly against the encroaching gloom of my small cottage. It was a battle waged on two fronts against the bitter, bone-aching cold that seeped through the ill-fitting timbers of the walls, and against the deeper, more insidious chill of the unknown that had begun to settle upon our village like a second, invisible winter. My world was the rough-hewn chair I huddled in, the threadbare blanket pulled tight around my shoulders, the gritty taste of wood smoke that clung to the back of my throat, and the fragile plume of my own breath, a fleeting white ghost in the frigid air of the room. Tangible proof of a life that felt increasingly precarious. Outside these fragile walls, the snow fell, and fell, as it had for weeks uncounted a relentless, silent siege, burying the familiar contours of our lives under a suffocating white shroud, erasing paths, softening the harsh edges of grief into a landscape of numb desolation. This was the year of our Lord 1348, a year that had promised nothing out of the ordinary, yet had delivered us into a season of such profound dread that even the name of God felt alien on our lips, as if he too had turned his face away, or perhaps was held captive by the same icy grip that held us. Our village, a small clutch of dwellings clinging to the folds of the earth between the stark, wine-scoured hills and the brooding expanse of the old wood of forest whispered by the elders to be more ancient than any king's decree. Its roots intertwined with the very bones of the land had never been a place of clamor. Even in the height of summer, its sounds were muted: the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the lowing of cattle, the murmur of voices carrying on the gentle breeze. But the silence of this particular winter possessed a different quality, a different timbre. It was not the peaceful quiet of a world at rest, but a heavy, weighted stillness, a silence that listened, that watched, that lurked. Every groan of the ancient roof timbers under their immense burden of snow, every sharp crack of ice forming on the eaves, every mournful sigh of the wind as it probed the weaknesses in our defenses, seemed to carry an unspoken premonition, a cold, ethereal breath from some other, unseen realm, seeking entry. The very air felt taut, as if holding its own breath in anticipation. I try, sometimes, to conjure the image of a genuine, untroubled smile, the kind that reaches the eyes and warms the beholder. But the memory is faint, like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. Smiles, these days, if they appeared at all, were brittle, fleeting things, like winter's sunlight on ice, a brief, almost painful flash of brightness that vanished before one could truly grasp it, leaving only a deeper sense of the surrounding cold. The way we met each other's gaze, those few of us who still ventured out or encountered one another by grim necessity, had altered beyond recognition. Gone was the easy familiarity, the unspoken understanding of shared lives. In its place was a guarded watchfulness, a flicker of suspicion, and underpinning it all, a raw, unnamed fear that coiled in the pit of the stomach and tightened the chest. Carried in the hushed, fragmented tales of infrequent travelers, merchants whose faces were gray with more than just road dust, or a solitary friar seeking shelter, his eyes haunted by sights he could not, or would not, fully articulate. A sickness, they whispered, a great and terrible pestilence, was uncoiling itself from the distant south, a shadowy serpent following the trade routes, carried in the holds of merchant ships, nestled in the belongings of pilgrims, and exhaled on the very air that men breathed. At first, these were mere rumors, half-believed stories that offered a grim sort of entertainment around the dwindling fires. On those interminable nights, they were distant horrors, belonging to other people, other places, sufficiently removed to be dismissed with a shiver as a bad dream from which one would surely awaken. But the whispers, like the encroaching frost, did not recede. They crept closer, their tendrils insinuating themselves into the fabric of our days. They grew louder, more insistent, each retelling imbued with a fresh and horrifying detail, until they were no longer abstract tales, but felt as palpable and immediate as the labored, rattling sigh of a dying man in the very next cottage, a sound one might hear through the thin wattle and daub if one dared to listen. The doors in our village, once symbols of welcome, often left ajar to invite a neighbor in for a shared cup of mulled cider, or a moment of fireside fellowship, were now uniformly, grimly shut, bolted, barred. They were drawn tight against the world, not just against the biting wind and the driving snow, but against the invisible contagion that was said to respect no barrier. Smoke still curled from the chimneys. Yes. Thin, hesitant ribbons of gray against a sky the color of lead, fragile threads that seemed to tether the last vestiges of life to an indifferent heaven. But this smoke spoke not of warmth and conviviality, but of isolated hearths, of families huddled within, counting their dwindling supplies and their even more rapidly dwindling hopes. The joyous cacophony of children's laughter, which once echoed through the village square, now deep in snow, was silenced, as if a sudden frost had blighted their young spirits. The hearty, boisterous gatherings of men in the small, smoky alehouse, their voices raised in song or argument, were a memory as distant as summer. The soft, rhythmic humming of women at their looms or mending worn garments by the rushlight, a sound that had once been the gentle heartbeat of our homes, had faded into the suffocating quiet. There remained only the ceaseless whisper of falling snow, the desolate moan of the wind, and the profound, expectant silence of waiting. Waiting for what? We dared not fully articulate, but the shape of it loomed large and dark in our collective imagination. My own eyes, through long, solitary hours spent staring out of the small, frost-glazed window of my cottage, had grown accustomed to discerning the subtle gradations of this monochrome world, to peering through the veil of the ever-present chill. I watched the skeletal trees of the old wood, their naked branches clawing at the bruised sky like the supplicating hands of the damned, each twig and bough etched with an agonizing clarity against the white. The snow draped them in a deceptively beautiful ermine cloak, yet it could not conceal their intrinsic desolation, their air of ancient, sorrowful endurance. Often, I would venture into that silent, brooding expanse, driven not by the need to hunt for the game. 2. Seemed to have sensed the encroaching doom and vanished into deeper, more secret recesses, but by the desperate necessity for firewood, to keep the encroaching iciness at bay, and perhaps, by a less tangible need to feel a different kind of solitude, a life force, however muted, that existed beyond the increasingly claustrophobic confines of the village, beyond the oppressive weight of human fear. But even the forest, my erstwhile sanctuary, felt altered. The familiar paths were obscured, transformed into treacherous, snow-filled gullies. The silence within its depths was more profound than any I had known, heavier even than the silence of the village. It was as if the ancient trees themselves were holding their breath, listening, waiting. The crisp snap of a twig under my boot sounded like a profanity in that hallowed quiet. The air was sharp, clean, yet carried an undercurrent of something wild and untamed that pricked at the senses, a reminder of the primal forces that lay just beyond our small, flickering fires. Sometimes, I would stand for long moments, head tilted, listening for the call of a bird, the rustle of some small creature in the undergrowth, any sign of the vibrant life that had once pulsed there. But there was only the soughing of the wind through the pine needles, a sound like the distant, sorrowful breathing of the earth itself, and the occasional soft thud of snow dislodged from an overburdened branch. It was a stark, elemental beauty, but it offered little comfort, reflecting instead the desolation that was steadily claiming our own small world. I find myself thinking, with a sharpness that is almost painful, of winters past. The snows were often as deep, the frosts as cruel, but there was a fundamental difference in their texture, in the spirit with which we faced them. Winter then was a known adversary, a harsh but necessary season of dormancy that heralded the certain promise of spring's renewal. It was a time for drawing together, for sharing what little we had: a story, a song, the warmth of a crowded room, the comfort of a shared hope. We mended our tools, read old tales, and looked forward with quiet anticipation to the lengthening days, to the thaw, to the first green shoots that would push through the stubborn earth. This winter, however, bore no such promise. It felt like a judgment, a final, irrevocable sentence. Each snowflake that drifted down from the leaden sky was not a harbinger of rest, but another grain of sand slipping through the neck of a vast, invisible hourglass, measuring out the lifespan of our dying world. The fire in my hearth, a small, defiant orange heart in the gathering gloom, has become my most constant, if not my only, companion. I feed it sticks and logs I've dragged from the reluctant forest, watching as it consumes them, transforming solid wood into heat, light, and ultimately, ash. Its flames leap and dance with a wild, untamed energy, casting a host of grotesque, elongated shadows that writhe upon the rough-hewn walls, creating a phantasmagoria of shifting shapes that seem to mock my solitude. I can lose hours simply staring into its depths, listening to the hypnotic crackle and hiss of a particularly resinous log, the soft sigh of embers collapsing. In those moments, I try to empty my mind, to let the warmth seep into my chilled bones and offer a temporary reprieve from the relentless gnawing of anxiety. But thoughts, like the insidious cold, are persistent intruders. They find the smallest crevice, the slightest lapse in vigilance, and seep in. Unwelcome and often unbearable, they are mostly fragments, shards of broken memories, the specific blue of a summer sky, the taste of ripe berries warm from the sun, the echo of a child's laughter, Alara's laughter, ringing clear as a tiny silver bell. Familiar faces swim before my eyes, their features once so vivid, now blurred by the mists of sorrow and the ever-present fear. And then there is the church bell. Its voice, or rather its many voices, has been the unwavering soundscape to my entire existence, marking the rhythm of our lives, both sacred and profane. The joyful, clamorous peal that summoned us to Mass each Sunday morning, its notes bouncing off the frosted fields in winter or a green and gold tapestry in summer. The festive, almost riotous ringing that celebrated a wedding, sending waves of communal joy rippling through the village. The gentler, more contemplative tones that accompanied a baptism, a promise of new life. And, of course, the death knell, the slow, sonorous, inexorable tolling, each strike a heavy weight upon the heart, guiding a departed soul on its journey and reminding those left behind of their own mortality. In recent weeks, it is this last voice, the somber lament of the death knell, that has become disturbingly, terrifyingly frequent. At first, its funereal pronouncements were for the very old, the frail, those whose threads of life were already worn thin, for whom the harshness of any winter could prove the final, insurmountable trial. We buried them with a familiar sorrow, a sense of inevitability, acknowledging the natural order of things, the turning of life's seasons. But then, the bell began to toll for those who were not so old, for men and women in the prime of their lives, for sturdy farmers and capable wives who, only the previous autumn, had been vital and strong, their laughter echoing across the harvested fields, their hands busy with the tasks of living. The sound of the bell acquired a new, more ominous resonance then. It was no longer just a marker of individual loss, but a rising chorus that spoke of something unnatural, something malevolent, that had been unleashed among us. Father Thomas, our priest, a man whose faith had once seemed as solid and unshakable as the ancient stone of the church itself, now seems to shrink with each passing day. His cassock hangs more loosely on his stooped frame. His face is a mask of gaunt fatigue. His eyes, once bright with fervor, are now hollowed out, sunk deep into shadowed sockets, reflecting a profound weariness of the soul. He still mounts the steps to the pulpit each Sunday, though the congregation dwindles with each passing week, and he still attempts to speak of God's mercy, of hope, of eternal salvation. But his voice, once so resonant and sure, now often falters, a tremor of uncertainty, of a deeply buried doubt, running through his carefully chosen words, a doubt he tries, with diminishing success, to conceal behind the familiar cadences of prayer and scripture. Sometimes, from my window, I see him standing alone in the small, snow-drifted cemetery that lies in the lee of the church, a solitary, black-clad figure gazing out over the growing number of fresh mounds, each covered by the same indifferent white mantle. He does not weep. None of us weep much anymore. It is as if our tear ducts have frozen solid, or perhaps the well of our grief has simply run dry, leaving behind only a parched and aching emptiness. The closed doors. If one image could encapsulate the desolation of this winter, it would be that of the closed doors. Every single one. Before this shadow fell upon us, a door in our village was rarely fully shut during daylight hours. It might be latched against a particularly keen wind, but more often it stood slightly ajar, an unspoken invitation, a sign of an open hearth and an open heart within. Neighbors moved freely between houses, sharing news, a cup of ale, a loaf of bread, the small joys and sorrows that constituted the fabric of our communal life. Now, those same doors are barricades, bolted from within, shuttered against the light. They stand as mute testaments to the fear that has atomized our community, reducing it to a collection of isolated, besieged households. Behind each one, a family is huddled, hoarding its meager resources, its dwindling warmth, and its even more precious, fragile sparks of life. But we all know, with a certainty that lodges like a shard of ice in the gut, that no matter how thick the oak, no matter how strong the iron bolt, these physical barriers are useless against the enemy we face. For it is an enemy that is unseen, unheard, that creeps through the smallest fissure, that rides upon the very air we must draw into our lungs to survive. Breath. Such a simple, unconscious act, the body's quiet rhythm, taken for granted for a lifetime, until it becomes labored, precious, or until one sees it materialize in the frigid air as a visible, ghostly cloud, a constant reminder of the tenuous thread that binds us to existence. Now, breath itself has become a source of terror. The sound of a cough, once an innocuous irritation, now carries the weight of a death sentence. A dry, hacking cough from the cottage next door, muffled by the intervening wall, but horribly distinct in the preternatural quiet, can send a jolt of pure adrenaline through one's veins, setting the heart to hammering against the ribs. A wheezing, struggling breath overheard in the stillness of the night is a sound that can curdle the blood, a harbinger of the inevitable, a prelude to the bell's next mournful summons. We have begun to listen to our own breathing, to monitor its depth, its regularity, with an almost obsessive attention, as if by sheer force of will we can keep it steady. Keep it clear. Keep it coming. I cannot erase the image of Alara, the blacksmith's daughter. Her hair, I remember, was the color of ripe summer wheat, a cascade of spun gold that caught the light when she moved. Her laughter, a sound so pure and unrestrained, was like the chimming of tiny, silver bells, a melody that could lift the heaviest spirit. It was only last autumn, when the leaves were turning to fire and the air was crisp with the promise of winter, that she had spoken with such excitement of the coming feast day. Her eyes shining, she had a new ribbon for her hair. Shed told me, blue as the summer sky. Then, her father, a man as strong and solid as the iron he forged, had taken to his bed. A sudden, violent fever that glazed his eyes and set his teeth to chattering. Then came the coughs, great, tearing paroxysms that seemed to rip through his mighty chest, leaving him gasping and exhausted. And then, inevitably, the church bell had begun its slow, dolorous lament. For him. I did not attend the burial. Few did. Fear had become a more powerful master than custom or compassion. I stood at a distance, on the brow of the hill overlooking the small, hastily consecrated plot of land far beyond the village perimeter, designated for these dead. I watched the dark plume of smoke rise from the pyre, for the ground was too frozen for easy digging. And a quicker, hotter disposal was deemed safer, and I held my own breath, trying not to inhale the acrid air that I imagined, with a sickening lurch in my stomach, was thick with the invisible seeds of death. That vibrant, laughing girl, Alara, with her sun-gold hair and her dreams of blue ribbons, had not sickened immediately. She had nursed her father, her small, determined face pale but resolute. Weeks later, the bell tolled for her, too. Her ashes, like her father's, mingled with the smoke, were carried away by the indifferent winter wind, dispersed and lost against the vast, gray canvas of the sky. Ashes. That is what remains when the fire has consumed its fuel. The gray, lifeless powder in the bottom of the hearth each morning. The bitter taste of them in the air when the wind shifts. The ashes of our hopes, our joys, our plans for the future all burned away, leaving only a cold, desolate emptiness. And soon, I cannot help but think, it will be the ashes of our entire village. A final, silent testament to a life that once was. Sometimes, in the brief, troubled interludes of sleep that offer little respite, I dream of spring. I see the sun, a benevolent golden orb in a clear blue sky. I feel its warmth on my skin. I see the snows melting, the rivers breaking free of their icy fetters, the first tender green shoots pushing stubbornly, miraculously, up from the thawing earth. I hear the impossible sound of birdsong, a joyous, intricate chorus heralding renewal. But then I awaken, and the dream shatters against the grim reality of the howling wind, the suffocating darkness, and the relentless, penetrating cold that seems to have seeped into the very marrow of my bones. Hope, I have come to understand, is a dangerous indulgence, a luxury we can no longer afford. It is a fire that, once extinguished, leaves an even deeper coldness behind. The whispers, they never truly cease. They have mutated, transformed. They are no longer just tales of distant suffering, of nameless, faceless victims in faraway lands. The horror is no longer out there, it is here. Within our walls, among us. People, those few who still dare to communicate, their voices low and strained, their eyes darting nervously as if the very air has ears, now speak of specific, terrifying symptoms, of the sudden onset of burning fevers that refuse all remedy, of the grotesque, dark swellings that appear in the groin, under the armpits, oozing a foul-smelling ichor, of the swift, agonizing descent into delirium and death, often within days, sometimes mere hours. They speak of entire families sealing themselves within their homes, of cries for help that go unanswered, of the desperate, animalistic howls of pain and despair that echo briefly in the frozen night, only to be followed by an even more terrible silence. The small fire in my hearth still burns, a solitary beacon against the encroaching tide of darkness, but its light seems dimmer now, its warmth less potent. Or perhaps it is not the fire that has changed, but me. Perhaps the cold is no longer merely an external force to be battled, but an internal landscape, a desolation that has taken root in the soul. I draw the ragged blanket tighter, seeking a warmth that is no longer there. My breath still forms its small, ephemeral cloud in the frigid air, a fleeting white marker of my own diminishing existence, each one a tiny, silent echo of the lives being extinguished all around me. Tonight, as on so many nights before, the church bell began its mournful song. 3 slow, deliberate, resonant tolls, each one falling like a hammer blow on the anvil of the night. A man. This time, or so the number of tolls proclaimed. I do not know his name. I do not wish to know. Each name, each remembered face, is another shard of grief to carry. Each toll of that accursed bell feels like another nail being hammered into the coffin of our dying village. It is no longer a summons to prayer, nor a lament for a single lost soul. It has become the death rattle of our world, our own last winter bell. I force myself to look out through the tiny, ice-encrusted pane of the window. The snow continues its silent, inexorable descent, each flake a perfect, six-sided crystal, unique and yet part of an overwhelming, undifferentiated whole. They drift and swirl in the faint, spectral light that spills from my own window, before settling softly, inexorably, upon the already buried world, adding another layer to the pristine, unblemished white, the white of innocence, the white of a bridal veil, the white of a funeral shroud, the white of bones bleached by the sun. There is a perverse, almost unholy peace in the contemplation of such utter desolation, the peace of absolute despair, when all is lost, when hope itself has withered and died. Then fear, too, can begin to lose its sharpest edge. Or perhaps it is merely that the fear has become so vast, so all-encompassing, that it has merged with the very fabric of existence, becoming as elemental as the air we breathe, the cold we endure, the silence we inhabit. A question, cold and sharp as an icicle, forms in my mind. Will spring ever truly return to this place? Will the sun ever again possess the strength to banish this unending winter? Will anyone be left to witness the melting of the snows, to hear the first tentative notes of a robin's song, to feel the life-giving warmth caress their skin? Or will all that remains be these empty, silent houses, their doors forever closed, their hearths forever cold, a ghost village swallowed by the forest and the snow, its only epitaph the sighing of the wind through the scalded trees? The embers in my hearth are dying now, collapsing in upon themselves, their fiery orange hearts fading to a dull, sullen red, then to gray. Darkness, patient and triumphant, seeps from the corners of the room, slowly, inexorably, swallowing the last vestiges of light. I make no move to replenish the fuel. What is the point? Let the darkness come. In the darkness, at least, I am spared the sight of my own haggard reflection in the small, cracked piece of polished metal that serves as a mirror. In the darkness, the shadows cannot dance their macabre ballet. The wind continues its mournful vigil outside, a ceaseless, keening lament for all that has been lost, and for all that is still to be taken. And woven into its ancient, sorrowful song, if I listen closely enough, I can still discern the whispers, faint, sibilant, pervasive, the whispers in the frost. They speak of the bitter end, of the approaching darkness, of a silence far deeper and more final than that of any mere winter's night. They speak of the last winter bell, and its final, irrevocable toll. I close my eyes. Not an anticipation of sleep, for sleep is a realm of treacherous dreams and fleeting, painful memories, but as a small act of surrender, the images remain, seared onto the insides of my eyelids, the endless white, the closed doors, the gaunt, haunted faces, the ever-present, mournful tolling of the bell. This winter, it feels, will never end, and its bell will ring and ring until there is no one left to hear its song. The days that followed the deepening of that winter's dread, the winter that had frozen more than just the rivers and the earth, settled into a strange, brittle rhythm. It was not a rhythm of life, but rather an imitation of it, a pantomime played out by figures increasingly resembling specters against a backdrop of unrelenting white. The snow continued its soundless tyranny, piling in ever deeper drifts against our doors, transforming the familiar lanes of our village into winding, narrow canyons that seemed to lead nowhere but to further isolation. The sun, when it deigned to show its face, was a pale, indifferent disk in the vast, metallic sky, offering little warmth and even less comfort, its light serving only to illuminate the starkness of our predicament, to etch the long, sorrowful shadows of the skeletal trees more sharply against the frozen ground. We still performed the motions of existence. Wood was gathered, though the forest seemed to recoil, hoarding its deadwood like a miser. Water was drawn from the well in the village square, a perilous journey that involved chipping away at the ice that formed almost as quickly as it was broken, each bucketful hauled back feeling heavier than the last, as if laden with the weight of our collective anxieties. Small, meager fires were tended, their hungry flames a constant demand on our dwindling resources, their flickering light a fragile shield against the encroaching darkness, both literal and metaphorical. But these actions were devoid of their former purpose, stripped of the meaning that work and sustenance once held. They were merely things done to mark the passage of time, to push back, however feebly, against the encroaching void. The whispers, those insidious harbingers of doom that had slithered into our village on the biting wind, had not ceased. They had merely changed their nature. They were less about distant horrors now, less about abstract, unseen contagions in faraway ports. They had become more specific, more localized, imbued with a chilling intimacy. They curled like wood smoke around certain names, certain cottages, a lingering cough from old man Hemlock's dwelling, usually dismissed as his winter ailment, now caused heads to turn, conversations to falter. The unusual stillness around the widow Elmsworth's cottage, a woman known for her early rising and bustling energy, bred a quiet, uneasy speculation. We were listening, always listening, our senses preternaturally sharpened by fear, straining to interpret the subtle shifts in the village's soundscape, the nuances of silence. It was young Thomas, the cooper's son, a lad barely 10 summers old with a mischievous grin and eyes the color of hazelnuts, who first brought the abstract terror into horrifying focus. Or rather, it was the small, persistent cough that began to issue from their cottage, a sound that, in any other winter, would have elicited little more than a passing remark, a suggestion of a warm posset or a poultice of herbs. His mother, Martha, a stout woman whose capable hands were rarely still, initially waved away any concern. A chill shed declared to a neighbor across a snowdrift, her voice perhaps a little too loud, a little too hearty. The boy played too long in the damp. That's all. A few days by the fire, a dose of motherwort tea, and he'll be right as rain. Oh, how desperately we clung to that fragile reassurance. A common cold, a winter cough, such ordinary, manageable afflictions. They were familiar landmarks in the known territory of illness, charted and understood. To admit to anything more sinister was to invite the unimaginable into our very homes. So, for a few days, the village collectively held its breath, listening to the small, dry coughs that punctuated the stillness around the cooper's dwelling, and prayed with a fervor born of desperation that Martha's diagnosis was true. But the cough did not yield to motherwort tea, nor to the warmth of the hearth. It deepened, became harsher, more resonant, a tearing sound that seemed too large for such a small chest. Lights were seen burning late in their cottage window, a solitary, flickering eye in the vast, indifferent darkness, a beacon of a family's anxious vigil. The narrator, from my own small hovel, would see that light and feel a cold dread coil tighter in my belly. One could almost hear the strained silence from within, broken only by those racking coughs and the murmured, useless words of comfort. John, the cooper, a man whose broad shoulders and strong arms could wrestle oak staves into submission, was seen pacing outside his own door, his face a mask of helpless anguish, his movements stiff and uncertain as if he himself were trapped within an invisible barrel of fear. He spoke to no one. No one dared approach him, What words could be offered when the unspoken terror hung so heavy in the air? Then came the night, a night like any other in that endless winter. Or so it seemed. The wind moaned its usual lament round the eaves, a low, mournful dirge for a dying world. The snow fell, soft and persistent, each flake a tiny, cold kiss of oblivion. The stars, if they were visible through the thick mantle of cloud, were distant and uncaring. Inside my own cottage, the fire had burned low, the shadows growing long and deep, peopling the small space with phantoms of my own making. I lay on my pallet, sleep a distant, unattainable shore, listening to the sounds of the night, to the creak of my own roof timbers, to the frantic beating of my own heart. And in that listening, I became aware of a change. The coughing from young Thomas' cottage, which had become a grim, accepted part of the night's soundscape, had ceased, not gradually, not fading into a more peaceful, sleeping breath, but abruptly. One moment it was there, a ragged punctuation in the stillness. The next, it was gone. And the silence that rushed in to fill the void was not a silence of peace, but a silence that was vast, empty, and utterly terrifying. It was a silence that screamed. I did not know then what had transpired, but a cold premonition, sharp and certain as a shard of ice, pierced through me. I lay there, frozen, straining my ears against the thick, muffling blanket of the night. But there was nothing, only the wind, and the snow, and that terrible, echoing silence from the Cooper's home. The dawn, when it finally broke, was gray and reluctant, unveiling a world leached of all color, all hope. The news, when it came, traveled not by word of mouth, for who would dare to be its bearer? It spread like a stain, a dark miasma seeping from the Cooper's cottage and into the frozen lanes. It was in the way John, the Cooper, eventually emerged from his doorway, his face not merely etched with grief, but hollowed out, aged by a century of sorrow in a single night. It was in the way he moved, like a man walking in his sleep, his eyes vacant, seeing nothing. It was in the low, animalistic keen that was torn from Martha's throat, a sound that bypassed the ears and struck directly at the heart, a sound of utter, irretrievable loss. Later, small, whispered fragments of the horror began to circulate, passed from one trembling lip to another. Young Thomas had worsened through the night, his breath growing shallow, rasping. The fever had burned fiercely, his small body racked with shivers despite the blankets piled upon him. His parents had watched, helpless, as the life force had ebbed from him, as the light in his hazel eyes had dimmed and flickered out. And then, as Martha had held him close, rocking him in her arms, his struggles had ceased. He had simply stopped breathing. Kangthunya, the child stops breathing. Those simple words, stark and brutal in their finality, resonated through the village with the force of a physical blow. That was the moment, the precise, terrible moment when the whispers, the rumors, the half-believed tales of a distant pestilence coalesced into a single, stark, undeniable reality. The monster was no longer a phantom lurking in the shadows of imagination. It had a face, the small, pale, peaceful face of a dead child. It had a name, though none yet dared to speak it aloud. Fear, raw and visceral, was no longer a creeping unease, but a palpable entity that stalked the village, its icy breath felt on every neck. The closed doors were bolted even more firmly now. The few individuals who had dared to venture out for necessities scurried through the lanes, like frightened mice, eyes darting, faces hidden deep within scarves, human contact avoided as if it were the touch of death itself. Suspicion, once a subtle undercurrent, now flowed openly. A sneeze, a slight cough, was enough to draw hostile, Fearful glares, the fragile bonds of community, already strained by hardship and uncertainty, began to unravel with terrifying speed. Each household became an island, adrift in a sea of fear. The question of the child's burial became a new torment. In ordinary times, the entire village would have gathered. The church bell would have tolled its slow, mournful lament. Father Thomas would have presided, his words offering the comfort of ritual, the promise of resurrection. But these were not ordinary times. The fear of contagion, the terror of touching, of even being near the body of one who had succumbed to this unknown malady, was overwhelming. I saw John the Cooper, his face a mask of gray despair, struggling alone in the frozen dawn to fashion a small, rough-hewn coffin from hoarded planks. There were no offers of help, no comforting hands on his shoulder. Men who had known him since boyhood, who had shared his bread and his ale, now averted their gazes, their faces tight with a mixture of pity and a more primal, self-preserving fear. Martha remained inside, her terrible, heartbroken keening the only sound that dared to defy the suffocating silence. Father Thomas did eventually appear, his own face a study in conflicting emotions, his duty warring with a very human terror. He stood at a distance, his prayer book trembling in his hands. His voice, when he finally spoke the rites, thin and reedy, almost lost in the vast, uncaring expanse of the snow-covered square. There was no procession to the graveyard. John, with a strength born of utter desperation, carried the small coffin himself, a solitary, tragic figure stumbling through the deep snow towards that desolate patch of ground beyond the village, where the earth was a little softer, a little less resistant to the bite of the spade. And the bell. The church bell remained silent, its rope hung limp and untouched in the belfry. Perhaps Father Thomas had deemed its tolling too provocative, too likely to shatter the village's already fragile composure. Or perhaps, more chillingly, no one, not even the priest, dared to ascend those narrow, dusty stairs, to touch the cold, possibly contaminated rope, to send that familiar, mournful sound out over a village that was now gripped by a fear far deeper than any sorrow. The silence of the bell was, in its own way, more terrifying than its tolling. It was an admission of defeat, a surrender to the invisible enemy that now held sway. For myself, the death of young Thomas was a profound and brutal awakening. The abstract dread that had gnawed at the edges of my consciousness for weeks now took on a definite, visceral form. It was no longer a question of if the pestilence would reach us, but when it would claim its next victim. The fragile illusion of safety I had tried to construct within the walls of my small cottage, with my meager fire and my solitary routines, crumbled into dust. Death was no longer a distant rumor, it was a neighbor. It had a child's face. I found myself watching my own breath with a new, heightened anxiety, imagining the invisible barbs, the seeds of corruption, that might be present in every inhalation. The frost on my window pane seemed to trace the patterns of bones, of skeletal fingers reaching for me. The whispers I heard now were not just those of the wind, or of frightened villagers, but the whisper of my own mortality. A soft, insistent murmur in the silence of my own heart. The village of my birth, the only world I had ever truly known, was transforming before my eyes into a charnel house. Its familiar lanes, pathways to the grave. The firelight still flickered, but its comfort was gone. Its dance now a dance macabre. The snow still fell, but its purity was a lie. A white shroud covering a festering sickness. The child who coughed was gone, and in his passing, he had unmasked the true face of our winter, stripping away the last vestiges of denial, leaving us exposed and trembling before the terrible certainty of what was to come. The whispers had finally found their voice, and it was the sound of a mother's unutterable grief, and the chilling silence of a child who would never draw a breath again. The silence young Thomas left behind, that vast, echoing void where his small coughs had once been, did not linger in its purest, most absolute form for long. It was a deceptive calm, the kind that settles over a battlefield when one skirmish ends, but before the true war begins. For in the days that crawled by, each one a repetition of the last in its gray, frozen monotony, a new sound began to etch itself into the grim tapestry of our existence, the church bell. It did not toll with the sudden, heart-stopping finality of a singular death knell, as it ought to have done for the cooper's son. Yet hadn't. Instead, it began to ring each morning, a chilling matins that had nothing to do with prayer or praise. As the first bleak light of dawn seeped into the world, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of ash and lavender, the bell would begin. 3 deliberate, sonorous chimes, then a pause, then 3 more, and then again. Not the hurried, joyful peal of a Sunday service, nor the slow, measured cadence for a soul departed in the night. This was something else, something new and terrible in its regularity. It was Father Thomas. We knew, though few saw him, he had taken it upon himself, this daily ritual. Perhaps he thought it a call to remembrance, a defiant assertion of faith in a world that seemed to have been forsaken by God. Or perhaps, and this was the thought that chilled me to the marrow, it was a tally, a morning count, a public acknowledgement of the void that was growing, day by day, in the heart of our village. For young Thomas was not the last, he was merely the first. The terrible, unspoken fear that his death had unleashed now found new purchase, new victims. It was as if his passing had opened a door, an unseen portal through which the pestilence, now bold and unmasked, could stalk freely among us, and its preference, it seemed, was for the young, the innocent, the most vulnerable. One by one, the children began to sicken. Little Elspeth, the weaver's daughter, whose laughter used to be like wind chimes on a summer breeze, fell silent. Her small, bright face, usually smudged with berry juice or dirt from her explorations, grew pale and waxen. Her parents, their faces already etched with the anxiety that had become our common language, tried to dismiss it as Alara's family had a winter fever, a passing ailment. They burned herbs, they murmured prayers, they kept a frantic, hopeless vigil by her small cot. But the outcome was the same. The small, labored breaths grew shallower, fainter, until they ceased altogether. Another light extinguished, another small voice silenced. Then it was young Will, son of John the Thatcher, a sturdy boy with a thatch of bright red hair who was always first to climb the tallest tree, or lead the snowball fights. His robust energy drained away as if an invisible tap had been opened, leaving him listless, then feverish, then still. His booming laugh, a sound that could once fill the village square, was replaced by the thin, rasping struggle for air, and then by nothing. The cradles in our village, those small, lovingly crafted wooden beds, many of them passed down through generations, began to empty. One by one, they stood in the dim corners of cottages, silent, accusing monuments to a future that would never be, where once there had been the soft gurgle of a sleeping infant, the fretful cry of a hungry babe, the gentle creak of a rocker soothing a child to sleep. There was now only an unbearable, hollow silence. The small blankets, often embroidered with hopeful symbols of birds or flowers, lay undisturbed. The tiny, worn wooden toys, clutched by small hands only days before, gathered dust. I would walk through the deserted lanes, my own breath pluming white in the frigid air, and the silence from these cottages was a physical weight, an oppression that crushed the spirit. I knew which homes housed young children, or rather, had housed them. I remembered their faces, their games, the sound of their feet pattering on the hard-packed earth in warmer days. Elspeth, with her missing front tooth and her infectious giggle. Will, with his scraped knees and his air of indomitable courage. Little Allie's, barely old enough to walk, her eyes wide with the wonder of a new world, her small hand clutching her mother's finger. Nah. Their windows were like vacant eyes, staring out onto a landscape of unrelenting white, their doors sealed tight not just against the cold, but against a grief too profound for public display. The term empty cradles began to be whispered, a phrase laden with such an unbearable weight of sorrow that it seemed to physically bend the shoulders of those who uttered it. The older generation in the village, those whose faces were already maps of past hardships, whose memories stretched back to leaner times, to other winters, other losses, began to find their own explanation for this unfolding horror. It was not merely a sickness, they declared, their voices raspy with age and a grim certainty. It was a punishment, a divine retribution. God's hand is heavy upon us, old Mother Elmsworth, her back bent like a weathered willow, but her eyes still sharp and unwavering, proclaimed to any who would listen, her voice cutting through the frightened whispers. We have strayed. We have forgotten his laws. These innocents, they are taken to scourge us, to remind us of our sins, her words, and those of others like her, the village elders, who gathered in small, hushed groups, their heads nodding in solemn agreement, spread like a different kind of contagion, a contagion of guilt, of fear rooted in a sense of cosmic justice. What sins, I wondered, were we, in our small, isolated community, truly more wicked than any other? Or was this simply the desperate human need to find meaning in the meaningless, to impose a narrative of cause and effect upon the chaotic cruelty of nature, or of God? Some found a strange, perverse comfort in this interpretation. If it was a punishment, then perhaps there was something that could be done: atonement, prayer, sacrifice. It offered a sliver of agency, however illusory, in the face of overwhelming helplessness. For others, like myself, it only deepened the despair, adding a layer of undeserved guilt to the already crushing burden of grief. To think that the suffering of these children, their small lives snuffed out before they had barely begun, was a deliberate act of a vengeful deity was a thought more chilling than the winter wind itself. And Father Thomas, he seemed caught in the maelstrom, his faith battered, his spirit weary. Each morning, without fail, he would climb the narrow, winding stairs to the belfry, the stone cold beneath his worn boots, the air thick with the dust of ages and the ghosts of countless past ringings. I imagined his hands, raw and chapped from the cold, grasping the thick, stiff rope. I imagined the immense effort it took, not just physically, but spiritually, to send that sound out over the silent, snow-shrouded village. The morning bell was no longer a summons, nor a simple tally. It had become a daily dirge, a relentless, auditory reminder of our slow decay. Its sound, once capable of lifting spirits, of uniting us in shared worship or communal sorrow, now felt like a hammer blow, each chime deepening the cracks in our fracturing world. Did Father Thomas believe he was calling us to repentance? Or was he, in his own way, simply marking time, a solitary sentinel chronicling the inexorable advance of death? His sermons, when he gave them to the handful of shivering souls who still dared to gather in the frigid, echoing emptiness of the church, were shorter, his words less certain. He spoke of Job, of inexplicable suffering, of a faith that must endure even in the face of divine silence. But his eyes, when they met mine, held not conviction, but a shared, hollowed-out despair. The grief of the parents was a raw, open wound in the village's heart. There were no words for it. How could there be? To watch your child, a part of your own flesh and blood, succumb to this invisible monster, to be powerless to ease their suffering, to hold their cooling body in your arms. It was an agony that defied language, that shattered reason. I saw John the Thatcher, a man whose hands were calloused and strong from years of working the reeds, sitting motionless on a log outside his cottage, staring blankly at the small, freshly turned earth in the makeshift graveyard, his face a mask of uncomprehending devastation. His wife, they said, had not uttered a word since Will had breathed his last, her silence more terrifying than any scream. Martha Cooper, young Thomas' mother, moved like a ghost, her once robust form shrunken, her eyes vacant, forever fixed on some inner landscape of unbearable loss. These were not the dignified sorrows of old age passing peacefully. This was violent, unnatural, a reaping of the unripened harvest. The natural order of things, children burying their parents, had been hideously inverted. Now, parents were laying their children in the frozen earth. Their hopes, their futures, buried alongside those small, still forms. The fabric of our village life, already frayed, was tearing apart. The communal spirit, that intricate web of shared tasks, mutual support, and unspoken understanding that had bound us together for generations, was dissolving under the acid of fear and grief. Trust had eroded. Who among us might be carrying the invisible seeds of death? Who might be next? The shared well became a place of silent, suspicious encounters. The dwindling supplies of firewood, of grain, became sources of bitter, unspoken resentment. Each family retreated further into its own besieged fortress, the closed doors a symbol of a community turning inward, consuming itself in its own terror. My own small fire, my nightly companion, offered less and less solace. Its flickering light seemed to mock the darkness that was consuming us from within. I would stare into the flames, seeing not warmth and life, but images of small, pale faces, of empty cradles, of the endless, falling snow. The whispers I heard were no longer just those of the wind, but the imagined cries of children, the heartbroken sobs of their mothers, the dry, rasping cough of the dying. The winter deepened its hold, the cold a relentless, physical manifestation of the plague's icy grip. The days grew shorter, the nights longer, each one a fresh eternity to be endured. The frost traced ever more elaborate, funereal patterns on my windowpane, like the intricate carvings on a tombstone. The children were gone, or nearly all of them. The laughter, the shouts, the patter of small feet, these sounds, which had once been the vibrant, joyful pulse of our village, were now just echoes in the memory, achingly poignant in their absence. The empty cradles stood as silent sentinels, guarding a future that had been stolen. The morning bell continued its grim, daily pronouncements, each toll a fresh spadeful of earth on the coffin of our collective hope. And the elders murmured of punishment, their words adding a chilling layer of divine judgment to our earthly suffering, leaving us to wonder if we were not only dying, but damned. The path ahead was obscured by the falling snow, and by a darkness far more profound than any winter's night. The morning bell, Father Thomas Grim Maddens, continued its funereal rhythm for a time, each chime a nail hammered into the coffin of a dying day, a dying hope. But as the sickness, no longer content with the tender sacrifice of our children, began to claim adults with an indiscriminate, terrifying rapacity, the nature of that tolling seemed to subtly shift once more. It grew less frequent, its somber voice sometimes falling silent for a day or two, only to resume with a renewed, almost frantic despair, as if Father Thomas himself was succumbing to the sheer weight of the dead. His arm too weary, his spirit too broken to mark every single passage. Or perhaps, and this thought carried its own peculiar chill, the numbers were now simply too great for any meaningful tally. For death had become our most constant companion, our most prolific harvester. The empty cradles were soon joined by empty chairs at hearthsides, empty pallets in sleeping alcoves, empty spaces in what was left of our communal memory. The sickness, in its adult victims, often presented with a swift and brutal ferocity. A man hale and hearty at dawn could be a fevered, delirious wreck by dusk, his body consumed by an inner fire, his skin erupting in the dark, telltale buboes that were the heralds of an agonizing end. The strong, the wake, the pious, the sinner it spared none. The village, already hollowed out by the loss of its young, now began to resemble a charnel house in slow motion. And with this escalation came a new, terrible problem: the disposal of the dead. The small, makeshift graveyard beyond the village, where young Thomas and the other children had been laid in the frozen earth, quickly became inadequate. The ground itself, hard as iron beneath its thick blanket of snow, resisted the bite of the spade. Each shallow grave a monumental effort for the dwindling number of men still strong enough, or brave enough, to undertake the task. Soon, even that grim labor became impossible. There were simply not enough hands left, not enough will, not enough consecrated ground. Bodies began to lie where they fell, in the cold, dark interiors of cottages, behind doors that were now sealed not just by fear, but by the finality of death. A new and more primal terror began to take root: the fear of the unburied, of the corruption that would surely follow, of a pestilence breeding upon pestilence. The crisp, cold air, which had once seemed so pure, now felt heavy, tainted with the unspoken threat of decay. I remember the precise moment when the shift occurred, the moment when the last vestiges of our ingrained reverence for the dead, our sacred rites of passage, finally shattered under the relentless pressure of necessity. It was not a decision made in council, for no such gatherings were possible anymore. It began, as such things often do, out of sheer, desperate pragmatism, born in the heart of one grieving family, then imitated by another, and another, until it became a grim, unspoken accord. Old Man Hemlock, who had lingered for weeks, his cough a fixture in the village soundscape, finally succumbed. His two grown sons, themselves gaunt and hollow-eyed, faced the impossible. Their father's body lay in their small cottage. The ground was impenetrable. Father Thomas was overwhelmed, perhaps even ill himself by then, his presence increasingly sporadic. No one else would come near. I saw them from a distance, their movements furtive, their faces masks of grim resolve under the weak light of a winter afternoon. They dragged something heavy, wrapped in a tattered blanket, out of their dwelling and towards the whispering, snow-laden boughs of the old wood. Later, as dusk began to bleed its gray and purple hues across the frozen sky, a new light flickered into existence at the edge of the forest. Not the warm, contained glow of a hearth fire, but a wilder, more malevolent orange, leaping and dancing against the dark silhouettes of the ancient trees. And then, the smell began. At first, it was faint, a mere suggestion on the wind, easily mistaken for the ordinary scent of wood smoke from a distant chimney. But it grew, inexorably, with each passing hour, with each new, ominous plume of smoke that rose from the secretive depths of the forest. It was a smell unlike any I had ever known, acrid and deeply unsettling, a grotesque perfume that clawed at the back of the throat and churned the stomach. It was the smell of burning flesh, the smell of scorched hair, the smell of mortality itself being rendered into its most elemental components. Ashes in the wind. The old wood, once a place of quiet solace or primal fear, now became our village's open-air crematorium. What began with Old Man Hemlock soon became the norm. The forest, which had witnessed the slow turning of centuries, the rise and fall of seasons, the comings and goings of uncounted generations, now became the final, fiery resting place for our dead. There were no prayers said, no rites observed, beyond the grim necessity of the act itself, just the crackling roar of the flames, the sickening stench, and the silent, swirling dance of ash carried aloft on the biting winter wind. The smell became a constant presence, an inescapable shroud that enveloped the village. It seeped through the cracks in our walls, clung to our clothes, tainted what little food we had. It was there when we awoke in the gray dawn, a nauseating reminder of the night's grim harvest. It was there as we huddled by our meager fires, its phantom presence mingling with the honest scent of burning wood, corrupting even that small comfort. It was there as we drifted into fitful, nightmare-ridden sleep. The wind, once a carrier of whispers and the scent of pine, now brought only the stench of our own incineration. The sight of the smoke became as common as the sight of the falling snow. Sometimes it was a single, dark column, rising greasy and black against the pale sky. Other times, particularly after a night when the sickness had been especially voracious, multiple pyres would burn, their collective smoke merging into a ghastly, impenetrable pall that hung over the forest's edge, obscuring the sun, casting our world into an even deeper twilight. Father Thomas, when he was seen, looked like a man utterly broken. The authority of the Church, its rituals and sacraments designed to provide comfort and order in the face of death, had been rendered meaningless. How could one speak of consecrated ground when bodies were being consumed by fire? In the unhallowed depths of the woods, how could one offer the solace of Christian burial when the primary concern was the swift, efficient disposal of a contagious corpse? He still rang the morning bell sometimes, but its voice sounded thinner now, almost apologetic, lost amidst the crackle of distant flames and the ever-present, pervasive odor of burning. The psychological toll of this new reality was immense. To know that your loved ones, your friends, your neighbors, were not laid to rest with dignity, but were consumed by fire like so much refuse, was a burden that stripped away the last vestiges of humanity. There was a terrible intimacy to it, this constant olfactory reminder of our collective fate. We were breathing in our dead, their ashes settling upon us like a ghastly, invisible snow. I remember watching a flake of grayish ash, larger than the others, drift down from the sky and land upon the pristine white surface of the snow outside my window. It was soft, ephemeral, yet it carried the weight of a human soul, a life extinguished and dispersed. This was what we had become, ashes in the wind. Our stories, our memories, our very beings, reduced to particulate matter, scattered to the four corners of a cold, indifferent universe. The fire, which had always been a symbol of life, of warmth, of community round the hearth, now acquired a terrifying new dimension. It was still our shield against the literal cold, but it had also become the agent of our ultimate dissolution. The same flames that offered a meager comfort in our homes were out in the forest, devouring the bodies of our kin with an insatiable hunger. The duality was a constant, unnerving presence in my mind. The closed doors of the village now hid not only fear and grief, but often the unacknowledged dead, awaiting their turn on the forest pyres. The whispers were no longer of symptoms or distant rumors. They were of who had been taken to the woods that day, whose smoke was currently tainting the air. The very fabric of our existence was saturated with death, not as a distant concept, but as a tangible, sensory reality. The sight of the smoke, the smell of the burning, the taste of ash on the wind. Hope, if any ember of it had remained, was finally, irrevocably extinguished by this constant, suffocating presence of the pyres. We were no longer merely dying, we were being systematically unmade, our community dissolving, our bodies rendered into nothingness, our essence scattered. The forest, keeper of ancient secrets, now held our most terrible one, its snow-covered floor undoubtedly richer with the residue of our passing, its trees silent witnesses to our profane departures. The wind sighed through its branches, no longer a mournful lament, but a dry, rustling whisper carrying the fine, gray dust of what once was us. Out into the unending winter, the pyres in the old wood continued to burn, their acrid smoke a constant, nauseating shroud that clung to our village, a perverse incense for the unending funeral rites of our dying world. The ashes, those fine, gray remnants of lives consumed, still drifted on the biting wind, settling like a malevolent hoarfrost upon the snow, upon our dwindling stores of firewood, upon the very thresholds of our sealed homes. Each day was a repetition of the last, the gnawing cold, the pervasive stench, the hollow ache of hunger, and the ever-present, soul-crushing fear. Hope, if it had ever been more than a fleeting illusion, had long since been reduced to just another form of ash, scattered and lost It was in this landscape of utter desolation, where death was the only certainty and despair the only shared communion, that a whisper of a different kind began to circulate. It was a hesitant, incredulous murmur at first, quickly stifled, as if the speaker feared attracting the attention of some malevolent force simply by uttering it. But it persisted, growing subtly in strength, a tiny, almost imperceptible countercurrent to the overwhelming tide of grief and horror. It concerned Agnes, the village midwife. Agnes was a woman set apart even before the pestilence had descended. She lived alone in a small cottage at the furthest edge of the village, where the cultivated fields gave way to the wilder fringes of the old wood. She was a solitary figure, her age indeterminate, her face a network of fine lines that spoke of a life lived in close communion with the earth, with its cycles of birth and decay. Her knowledge was not of books or scriptures, but of the old ways of herbs gathered by moonlight, of poultices and decoctions passed down through generations of women who had listened to the whispers of the plants and the rhythms of the body. In healthier times, she was sought after for her skill in easing childbirth, for her remedies for common ailments. Her hands, though gnarled, possessing a surprising gentleness, but in this new era of the Great Death, her traditional skills had proven as futile as Father Thomas' prayers, or so we had thought. The whisper centered on young Elmsworth, grandson of old Mother Elmsworth, who had so vehemently proclaimed the plague a divine punishment. The lad, barely into his manhood, had been struck down with all the terrifying swiftness and violence of the sickness. The dark, ominous swellings had appeared, the fever had raged, and his family had resigned themselves to the inevitable, their lamentations already beginning. He was, by all accounts, beyond any human aid, his breath a shallow, rattling struggle in his chest. Then Agnes had appeared. No one knew who had summoned her, or if she had come of her own accord. Drawn by some instinct or premonition, she had entered the Elmsworth cottage, a place already steeped in the shadow of impending death, and had remained there for 2 days and 2 nights. Lights were seen burning within, not the frantic, fearful flickering of a death vigil, but a steady, unwavering glow. Strange, unfamiliar scents, sharp and pungent, were said to have emanated from the dwelling, momentarily overpowering even the pervasive stench of the forest pyres. And then, on the 3rd morning, young Elmsworth, pale and terribly weakened, but alive, had sat up and asked for water. The news, when it finally broke free of the Elmsworth's stunned disbelief, rippled through the skeletal remains of our village with the force of an earthquake. Alive. Cured. It seemed impossible, a cruel jest. We had grown so accustomed to death's dominion that the concept of recovery felt alien, almost sacrilegious. Yet, the evidence, however improbable, was there. Young Elmsworth, though still frail, was breathing easily, the fever broken, the horrifying buboes visibly receding. He had walked out of the shadow of the valley of death. For a fleeting moment, a wild, irrational flicker of hope ignited in the village. Could it be? Had Agnes, with her ancient knowledge, found a chink in the pestilence's armor? Was there a reprieve, a way out of this unending nightmare? But this nascent hope was almost immediately choked, not by disbelief in the cure itself, but by the terrible, unspoken question that began to form in its wake. A question born of another, concurrent tragedy. Agnes had a daughter, Lyra. A quiet, gentle girl with eyes the color of forest moss, who moved with the shy grace of a wild deer. She was her mother's shadow, her apprentice in the lore of herbs and healing, her sole companion in their isolated cottage. Lyra had not been seen since Agnes had entered the Elmsworth home, and when Agnes herself finally emerged, her face drawn and gray as ash, her eyes holding a sorrow too deep for tears, she was alone. The whispers began anew, darker now, tinged with a dread that was different from the fear of the plague itself. Lyra, it was said, had fallen ill while her mother was tending to young Elmsworth. Some claimed Agnes had neglected her own child in her obsessive focus on the stranger. Others murmured a more sinister theory that Agnes, in her desperation to find a cure, had experimented on Lyra, using her own daughter as a vessel for some dangerous, untried remedy. But the darkest whispers, those spoken in the deepest shadows, hinted at something far more terrible, something that resonated with the ancient, primal fears that lay dormant beneath the veneer of our Christian faith. They spoke of a price, a sacrifice. She made a pact. Old Mother Elmsworth, her initial shock at her grandson's miraculous recovery now tinged with a fearful awe, was heard to croak, her voice trembling, "A life for a life." The old magic, the dark ways. She called upon powers that should remain undisturbed. Of a demonic bargain struck, spread like wildfire through the tinder-dry souls of the village. It made a terrible kind of sense to minds steeped in generations of folklore, minds already battered into a state of superstitious terror by the unrelenting onslaught of death. How else to explain such an impossible cure, such a singular defiance of God's apparent will, if not through recourse to forbidden arts? And Lyra's death, so tragically coincidental, so symbolically potent, became the irrefutable proof of this unholy transaction. The midwife had saved one life. Yes. But the cost, they whispered, had been her own daughter's soul, offered up to some shadowy entity in exchange for the forbidden knowledge, the power to cheat death. The single, miraculous cure did not bring solace. It brought a new kind of fear, a moral revulsion that was, in some ways, even more unsettling than the straightforward terror of the plague. The pestilence was a known enemy, however monstrous. But this hinted at a corruption from within, at human agency aligning itself with forces of darkness. Agnes Cottage, once merely isolated, now became a place of active dread. No one approached it. Children, those few who remained, were warned away with dire threats. Her door, which had always stood slightly ajar, a quiet invitation to those in need, was now firmly, resolutely closed, a barrier behind which unspeakable secrets were presumed to fester. The smoke that curled from her chimney, once a simple sign of a hearth fire, was now scrutinized with suspicion, imagined to be the fumes of some unholy incense or the burning of strange, forbidden ingredients. I found myself drawn, morbidly, to watch her dwelling from afar. I saw her, sometimes, a fleeting, stooped figure moving in her small, overgrown garden, gathering herbs as she had always done. But her movements were slower now. Her shoulders bowed, as if under an invisible weight. Her face, when I caught a glimpse of it, was a mask of impenetrable sorrow. Was it the grief of a mother who had lost her only child to the same sickness that ravaged us all? Or was it something more complex? The torment of a woman who had made an unbearable choice, who carried a terrible secret, a knowledge bought at an unimaginable price. I could not say. And in that not knowing, the whispers found fertile ground to grow. The fire in my own hearth seemed to offer even less comfort now. I would stare into its flames and imagine other fires, hidden deep in the woods, where ancient rites were performed, where pacts were sealed in blood and shadow. The ashes that drifted on the wind, once solely the remnants of our dead, now seemed to carry a different taint, the residue of a darker alchemy. The empty cradles of our village spoke of a loss inflicted by a pitiless disease, but the implied emptiness in Agnes' life, the absence of Lyra, spoke of a loss that was perhaps chosen, however desperate the circumstances, and that, somehow, felt even more chilling. The village was split. A few, their own loved ones hovering on the brink of death, were said to have approached Agnes Cottage under the cloak of darkness, their desperation outweighing their fear, begging for her help, for the secret of her cure. They were met with silence, with a closed door that would not yield. Others, the more vocal majority, spoke of driving her out, of cleansing the village of her unholy presence before she brought further divine wrath upon us. Father Thomas, his authority already weakened, his spirit frayed, seemed powerless to intervene, his sermons on faith and repentance falling on ears deafened by fear and superstition. The single cure, young Elmsworth's Lazarus-like return from the brink, had not lit a beacon of hope. Instead, it had cast a long, dark shadow, a shadow of moral ambiguity, of forbidden knowledge, of a sacrifice that may or may not have been. The midwife's secret, whatever its true nature, hung heavy and unspoken in the frigid air, a miasma of doubt and fear that was, in its own way, as suffocating as the smoke from the forest pyres. We had been given a glimpse of a potential reprieve from the plague, but it had come in such a terrifying, morally compromised guise that it offered no solace, only a deeper descent into the heart of darkness. The whispers of the wind now carried not just ashes, but accusations, and the chilling possibility that in our midst walked one who had bargained with the devil for the gift of life. The shadow cast by Agnes, the midwife, and her terrible, ambiguous secret did not recede. Instead, it deepened, intertwining with the already pervasive gloom that the smoke from the forest pyres had draped over our village. The single, miraculous cure, bought at the perceived cost of her own daughter's life, had not mended the unraveling fabric of our community. It had merely introduced a new, more insidious thread of suspicion and superstitious dread. Where once there was a shared enemy in the pestilence, now there was a splintering, a turning inward, a fear that the true monsters might not be the invisible seeds of disease, but the desperate, morally compromised souls of our fellow survivors. The winter, relentless and unforgiving, tightened its icy fist. The days were uniformly gray, the sun a forgotten memory. The wind, that constant, mournful companion, seemed to carry not just the stench of ash and burnt hair from the old wood, but also the chill of this new, internal frost that was freezing the very heart of our village. The pyres still burned, though perhaps less frequently now, not because the sickness had abated, but because the number of those able, or willing, to perform the grim task of hauling bodies to the forest's edge was dwindling with each passing day. It was a subtle shift at first, this final descent into utter isolation. It began not with a decree or a sudden event, but with a slow, creeping paralysis of will, a culmination of all the horrors we had endured. The empty cradles, the daily tolling of a bell that had become a dirge, the pervasive smoke of the pyres, and now, the chilling whispers of black magic and human sacrifice. It was all too much. The human spirit, stretched taut for so long, finally began to snap. The doors in our village, those flimsy wooden barriers against a world gone mad, began to stay shut, not just closed against the night or the biting wind, as they had been, not just bolted out of a generalized fear of the contagion that drifted on the air. Nah, they were sealed with a terrifying finality, with a desperate, inward-looking resolve that precluded all possibility of communion, of aid, of shared humanity. Wedges were hammered under them from the inside. Heavy chests or pieces of crude furniture were dragged to barricade them. Shutters, if a cottage possessed them, were latched and barred, plunging the interiors into a perpetual twilight. It was as if each household had become a besieged tomb, its occupants resolved to meet their fate, whether from sickness or starvation, in absolute, self-imposed solitude. The narrow, snow-choked lanes, once pathways connecting our lives, now wound between rows of these silent, sealed mausoleums. To walk through the village, a journey I undertook only when the gnawing hunger, or the desperate need for firewood outweighed the profound terror of what lay beyond my... And then came the most horrifying manifestation of this societal collapse, the refusal to tend to one's own deceased kin. The forest pyres, which had represented a desperate, communal attempt to manage the overwhelming tide of death, began to dwindle for a new reason. It was no longer solely a matter of too few able-bodied men. Nah, it was a matter of will. Or rather, the utter lack of it. Families, barricaded within their homes, began to keep their dead with them. The thought of it, the sheer, unimaginable horror of it, was enough to curdle the blood, to live alongside the cooling, stiffening body of a loved one, a spouse, a parent, a sibling in the cramped, frigid darkness of a sealed cottage, the air growing thick with the sweet, cloying scent of decay, mingling with the ever-present wood smoke and the stench of fear itself. This was a new circle of hell, one we had willingly, or unwillingly, constructed for ourselves, the most sacred duty, the final act of love and respect, the committal of the body to the earth or to the flames, was abandoned. Why? The reasons were as numerous and as complex as the fears that gnawed at our souls. There was the sheer, paralyzing terror of the contagion, the belief that the very air around the deceased was thick with death. There was the profound physical weakness of the survivors, many already touched by the sickness or ravaged by hunger and despair, lacking the strength to move a body, let alone drag it to the forest. And then there was the deeper, more insidious reason, the one that spoke of our ultimate undoing. People had begun to fear each other, more than the disease itself. The living, in their desperation, were perceived as a threat. Who knew what madness, what violence, might be born of such extreme suffering? A neighbor was no longer a potential source of comfort or aid, but a potential carrier of the plague, a potential thief of one's meager resources, a potential threat to one's own precarious existence. The social contract, already in tatters, had been utterly voided. Every man, every woman, every family unit was an island, fiercely guarding its own rapidly diminishing territory, its own fleeting hold on life. My own isolation became absolute. The small acts of observation, the furtive glances at other cottages, the strained, distant encounters at the well, even these ceased. When I ventured out, cloaked and hooded, my face muffled against the cold and the stench, I moved like a wraith through a city of ghosts. My heart hammered in my chest, not just from the fear of the invisible pestilence, but from the terror of encountering another living soul. What would I do? What would they do? Would we pass in silent, averted dread, or would desperation lead to something worse? I carried my wood axe not just for felling saplings, but as a grim, unspoken deterrent. The sounds of the village changed again. The morning bell, Father Thomas' desperate assertion of faith, fell silent. Whether he was dead, or too ill, or had simply succumbed to the overwhelming futility of his task, I did not know. Its absence was, in a way, a relief, for its daily tolling had become an unbearable reminder of our losses. But the silence it left behind was a different kind of tormented dead. Flat silence, broken only by the mournful howl of the wind and, sometimes, if I listened with an almost unbearable intensity, by muffled sounds from within the sealed houses, a choked sob, a low moan of pain, or, most terrifyingly, nothing at all from a cottage where life had, until recently, still flickered. The pyres in the old wood guttered and died, one by one. No new bodies were brought. The forest, for a brief time, was spared its gruesome task, but the air in the village grew heavier, more fetid. The scent of the pyres replaced by a closer, more intimate aroma of decomposition, a smell that hinted at the horrors hidden behind those locked doors. Agnes, the midwife, what of her? Her cottage, at the edge of the wood, had always been isolated. Now, her isolation was simply the norm, mirrored by every other dwelling. Was her door, too, sealed from within? Or did she, the suspected purveyor of black magic, the woman who had cheated death at a terrible price, exist outside this new, fear-driven convention? I did not know. I did not dare to venture close enough to find out. She, like the rest of us, was lost in the general miasma of fear and suspicion. The whispers about her dark arts had faded. Not because they were disbelieved, but because new, more immediate horrors had superseded them. When every neighbor is a potential threat, the fear of a distant witch loses some of its urgency. The fire in my hearth was my only constant, my sole companion in the waking nightmare. I fed it sparingly, hoarding my dwindling supply of wood. Its light pushed back the oppressive darkness of my small cottage, but it could not penetrate the deeper darkness that had settled in my soul. I would stare into the flames and see not hope, but a reflection of the consuming fires of the pestilence, of the funeral pyres, of the burning away of our world. My breath, pluming in the cold air of my own home, was a constant, fragile reminder of my own mortality. Each exhalation a small victory, each inhalation a gamble. The empty cradles were now joined by empty rooms, entire cottages standing silent and dark, their occupants consumed, their stories ended. The ashes that the wind had once carried from the forest now seemed to settle from within the village itself. A fine, invisible dust of despair, of humanity surrendered. We had sought refuge behind our locked doors, hoping to keep death out, but in doing so, we had merely trapped ourselves inside with it, inviting it to feast not just on our bodies, but on our souls, on the very essence of what it meant to be human. The doors stayed shut. They were monuments to our fear, to our broken trust, to the chilling realization that in the face of utter catastrophe, the greatest threat to mankind was, perhaps, man himself. The silence behind them was the sound of a community that had ceased to exist, each sealed dwelling a tiny, self-contained apocalypse, waiting for the end in solitary, abject terror. The winter wind howled around these self-made tombs, its voice the only lament for a village that had, in all the ways that truly mattered, already died. The world beyond my own sealed door had contracted to a landscape of grim imaginings, punctuated only by the necessities that drove me on infrequent, terror-filled excursions into the frozen, silent lanes. Each cottage I passed was a tomb, self-made or plague-claimed, its windows vacant eyes staring out at the unrelenting white, its door a final, unyielding barrier. The silence of our village was no longer the expectant hush of waiting, nor the respectful quiet of mourning. It was the dead, flat silence of resignation, of a world that had given up its ghosts, because the ghosts were now the majority, and the living were too afraid, too weary, to even acknowledge their passing. The wind, that tireless scavenger, still carried the faint, phantom stench of ash from the now dormant forest pyres, a reminder of a time when we still made some distinction between the quick and the dead. Now, even that grim ritual had largely ceased. It was in this nadir of human connection, this abyss of fear where each soul was an island of despair, that I began to sense something different, a subtle anomaly in the uniform desolation. It was centered around the cottage of young Mary, daughter of the woodcutter who had been among the first of the adults to fall. Months ago it seemed, though time itself had become a distorted, meaningless thing. Her cottage, like all others, was sealed. Its door was shut tight, its single small window shuttered against the world. Yet, there were discrepancies, tiny fissures in the void of utter abandonment that pricked at my heightened, almost animalistic senses. Sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, when the cold was at its most biting and the silence most profound, I would fancy I saw the faintest, most fleeting glimmer of light from behind the ill-fitting shutters of Mary's window, not the steady, mournful glow of a death vigil, but something more furtive, more carefully concealed. Once, on a desperate foray for scraps of firewood at the edge of the village, I thought I heard a sound from that direction, a muffled cough, quickly stifled. That was not the dry, racking signature of the plague, but something more human, more ordinary, if any sound could be called ordinary anymore. These were mere impressions, perhaps born of my own solitude-induced madness, yet they lodged in my mind. A small, persistent splitter of curiosity in the numb flesh of my despair. Then, I remembered Thomas the shepherd. He had been absent from the village since the late autumn, having taken his small flock, one of an ever-dwindling number, to the sheltered southern pastures, a common practice to escape the worst of our highland winters, to find grazing where our own hills were bare. He was a quiet lad, sturdy and kind-eyed, and it had been whispered, in those distant, almost forgotten days of communal living, that his heart was set on Mary, and hers on him. Theirs was a gentle, unspoken courtship, the kind that unfolds slowly in small villages, marked by shared glances at the well, a lingering touch when passing a loaf of bread, the silent promise of a future together. What if Thomas had returned? The thought struck me with a sudden, cold clarity. Returned to find not the village he had left, but this charnel house, this labyrinth of fear and sealed doors. Returned, perhaps, carrying with him not just the weariness of his journey, but the seeds of the pestilence itself, contracted in some less blighted, or differently blighted, corner of the world he had traversed. The pieces began to fall into place, forming a terrible, poignant mosaic in my mind. If Thomas had returned, sick and alone, to a village that had devoured itself in fear, where every door was barred not just against the plague, but against fellow man, and if Mary, his Mary, still lived, her heart still capable of that reckless, dangerous emotion called love. The attic. Many of our cottages, Mary's included, possessed a small, cramped loft space beneath the eaves, accessible usually by a rickety ladder, used for storing dried herbs, old tools, or forgotten belongings, a place of darkness, dust, and spiders, a place where someone, if they were small enough, desperate enough, could be hidden. My imagination, starved for any narrative beyond the monotonous cycle of death and decay, seized upon this possibility. I pictured Mary, her face a mixture of love, terror, and fierce determination, helping a feverish, stumbling Thomas into her cottage under the cloak of some deep, snow-muffled night. I saw her guiding him, not to the relative comfort of a pallet by the dying hearth, but up that treacherous ladder, into the suffocating darkness of the attic, a secret kept not just from the plague, but from the remnants of the village, from the fear that would surely condemn them both if discovered. Love, in our dying world, had become the most dangerous contraband of all. To shelter the sick, to offer comfort when contact itself was a death sentence, was an act of supreme folly, a betrayal of the brutal new creed of self-preservation that now governed us. If Mary was indeed hiding Thomas, she was risking not only her own life, a risk perhaps deemed acceptable for love, but she was also, in the eyes of any who might discover them, creating a hidden reservoir of the pestilence, a secret threat to the few remaining souls who clung so desperately to their isolated existence. Behind that sealed door, behind those shuttered windows, a different kind of drama was unfolding than in the other silent tombs of our village. Here, it was not just fear and the slow surrender to death or starvation. Here, there was a desperate, clandestine battle for life, fueled by an emotion that had been all but extinguished elsewhere. I could almost feel the oppressive atmosphere within that small space, the stifling air of the attic, thick with the scent of sickness and fear, the hushed whispers, the shared breaths that were both a comfort and a terrible gamble. Mary, tending to her beloved, bringing him water and what little food she could spare, her movements furtive, her ears constantly straining for any sound from outside that might signal discovery. Thomas, consumed by fever, by guilt at the danger he had brought upon her, by the agony of his failing body. This secret, if it existed, was a tiny, flickering candle flame in the vast, howling storm of our desolation. It was an act of profound humanity, a testament to a bond that refused to be severed even in the face of annihilation. And yet, It was also an act of terrifying recklessness. What if his sickness progressed? His cries or delirium became too loud to conceal. What if Mary herself succumbed, leaving him to die alone and undiscovered in that suffocating darkness? His presence eventually revealed by the one scent that even our fear-dulled senses could not ignore. The narrator, the solitary observer, felt a strange mixture of emotions contemplating this possibility. There was a profound sadness, of course, for their almost certain doom. There was a cold dread at the potential consequences should their secret be breached. But there was also, deep within the layers of my own fear and cynicism, a tiny, reluctant flicker of something akin to warmth, perhaps even admiration. In a world where humanity had been stripped bare, reduced to its most primal, selfish instincts, this act of love, however dangerous, however doomed, shone with a faint, almost unbearable light. It was a reminder that even amidst the ashes, some embers of the human spirit, of loyalty, of sacrifice for another, might still glow. The doors of our village stayed shut, each one a barrier against the contagion, against the perceived threat of the other. But Mary's door, if my imaginings were true, was shut for a different reason. It was not merely keeping the world out, it was keeping a precious, terrible secret in. It was a sanctuary and a prison, a haven of love and a potential tomb. The silence that emanated from it was no longer the silence of empty despair, but the taut, vibrating silence of a hidden life, a hidden love, a hidden, ticking clock. I did not know their fate. I could only watch, from my own desolate outpost, for the smallest signs, a thin curl of smoke from her chimney, more than what one person might need, a fleeting shadow at the shuttered window, the almost imperceptible change in the atmosphere around that one particular cottage, a tiny eddy in the stagnant pond of our collective misery. Love, which in better times was the wellspring of life, the foundation of community, the promise of continuity, had, in our blighted world, become a profound and terrible danger. It was a weakness, a vulnerability, a beautiful, tragic flaw that could lead to utter destruction. And yet, as I huddled by my own dying fire, the wind rattling my shutters, the image of that young girl and her shepherd, hidden away in their precarious attic sanctuary, was the only thing that felt even remotely alive in a village that had otherwise completely surrendered to death. Their dangerous love was a whisper of defiance in the face of the void, a testament to a bond that, for a little while longer, refused to be broken by the long, cold winter of our despair. The fragile, desperate human dramas that had flickered briefly in the suffocating darkness of our sealed village. Mary's hidden love for her shepherd, Agnes' terrible secret seemed to recede, to be swallowed whole by a new, overwhelming wave of the pestilence itself. It was as if the plague, having toyed with us, having allowed us these small, tragic diversions, now decided to unleash its full, unmitigated fury, to demonstrate the true, horrifying extent of its power. The period of locked doors and the silent accumulation of the dead within homes had been a prelude, a grim antechamber to the slaughterhouse this chapter of our lives was to become. It was no longer a matter of whispers, of distant pyres, or even of the chilling implications of a single, miraculous cure. Nah. The sickness was a roaring, undeniable presence, its breath hot and fetid in every unsealed crack, its touch a death sentence delivered with horrifying speed and efficiency. The very air within the village, already thick with the ghosts of the unburied and the lingering scent of fear, grew heavier still, saturated with the palpable miasma of rampant disease, driven by a hunger that gnawed with an almost equal ferocity to the fear that had kept me imprisoned. I was forced more often into the frozen, silent lanes, my axe clutched not just for wood, but for a defense I prayed I would never need. And it was in these desperate excursions, these fleeting, terrified glimpses into the abyss, that the true face of the pestilence was revealed to me in all its unsparing horror. Before, I had seen its aftermath, the grief, The fear. The societal collapse. Now, I witnessed its workings, its artistry of destruction upon the human form. The first, most striking horror was the Mohen, the blackness. It would begin, often, in the extremities, the tips of fingers, the lobes of ears, the tender flesh of the nose. A bruised, purplish discoloration at first, then deepening, spreading, until the flesh itself seemed to die, to mortify, turning a ghastly, leathery black, cold and unresponsive to the touch. I saw a woman, her face a mask of frozen terror visible for a fleeting moment through a gap in her shutter, holding up a hand where the fingers were no longer fingers, but blackened, withered claws. The sight seared itself into my memory, a testament to the plague's grotesque power to unmake us, to transform the familiar contours of the human body into something alien and horrifying. Then there were the pustules, the buboes. These were not the simple spots of a common ailment. These were monstrous, agonizing swellings, appearing with terrifying suddenness in the groin, the armpits, the tender flesh of the neck. They would grow with alarming speed, taut and inflamed, sometimes reaching the size of a hen's egg, or even a small apple, filled with a foul, corrupt matter. The pain, I could only imagine, must have been excruciating. A constant, burning agony that drove its victims to madness, through cracks in doors, or from cottages where the occupants were too far gone to care about sealing themselves off. I sometimes saw bodies contorted in unimaginable pain, hands clawing at these terrible growths, as if to tear them from their own flesh. And the nights became a symphony of suffering, an unending chorus of Ting-Ran groans that seemed to be ripped from the very depths of tormented souls. The thin walls of our cottages offered little barrier to these sounds. They seeped into my own small, cold refuge, mingling with the howl of the wind, transforming the darkness into a living entity, pulsating with the agony of my neighbors. There were the low, continuous moans of those sinking into the feverish delirium, the sharper, more desperate cries of those in the throes of acute pain, and sometimes the sudden, gurgling rattle of a final, obstructed breath, followed by a silence that was, if possible, even more terrifying. Sleep became a distant memory, each attempt to find oblivion thwarted by this inescapable soundtrack of death. The scent of the village changed again. The faint, lingering smell of wood smoke and the acrid tang of the distant forest pyres were now overwhelmed by a closer, more visceral odor, the sweet, cloying smell of sickness, of unwashed bodies consumed by fever, and the unmistakable, pervasive stench of corruption as the unburied dead within the sealed cottages began to yield to the final indignity of decay. It was a smell that clung to everything, that seemed to coat the back of the throat. A constant, nauseating reminder of the pestilence's dominion. I recall one cottage, belonging to a family named Fletcher, a father, a mother, two young children whose laughter I vaguely remembered from a forgotten summer. For days, sounds of terrible suffering had emanated from within the high-pitched wails of the children, the deeper, agonized groans of the parents. Then, silence. A profound, unbroken silence that lasted for what seemed an eternity. One morning, driven by a desperate need for water from the village well, I passed their door. It had been forced partially open, perhaps by the frantic, final struggles of its occupants, or by some desperate scavenger whose own fear had been momentarily overcome by need. A sliver of the interior was visible. I did not look closely, I could not bear to, but the glimpse I caught was of a scene of utter, unimaginable desolation, bodies intertwined in a final, grotesque embrace, their forms already touched by the blackness, the air round them thick with the visible miasma of death. I fled, my heart hammering. The image burned into my retinas. The village was dying, not slowly, not one by one, as it had seemed before, but in a great, consuming wave. The grim statistic that had once been a whispered fear now became an undeniable reality. More than half of us were gone, considerably more, of the perhaps 200 souls who had once called this place home. I doubted if even a quarter remained. The lanes were utterly deserted. Cottages stood empty, their doors gaping like open mouths in a silent scream, or sealed tight, hiding their gruesome secrets. The paths were untrodden, the snow lying deep and undisturbed. Save for my own furtive tracks, the sense of emptiness was overwhelming. A vast, echoing void where life had once thrived. The plague, in its terrible passage, had scoured us clean. It was like a monstrous, invisible storm that had swept through, tearing the leaves from the trees, uprooting the ancient oaks, leaving behind a landscape of utter devastation. There was no rhyme or reason to its choices, no discernible pattern to who it took and who it spared. It was a force of nature, blind, implacable, and utterly indifferent to our prayers, our fears, our pathetic attempts to resist. My own survival through this peak of horror felt like a perverse miracle, a cruel jest played by fate. Each morning I awoke, my breath pluming in the frigid air of my cottage. Was a fresh shock, a renewed confrontation with my own improbable existence. Why me? Why had I been spared when so many stronger, better, younger souls had been taken? There was no answer, only the gnawing guilt of the survivor, the terrible burden of witnessing so much suffering and being powerless to alleviate it. I moved through those days like a ghost myself, my senses simultaneously dulled by the constant exposure to horror, and preternaturally sharpened by the instinct for self-preservation. My meager stores of food dwindled. The firewood I gathered was never enough to truly banish the cold. But I clung to life with a grim, almost bestial tenacity, driven by some primal urge that defied reason, that defied despair. Of Father Thomas, there was no sign. The church stood silent and empty, its bell rope swaying gently in the drafts that whistled through the broken panes of its stained glass windows, its altar gathering dust. Agnes, the midwife, was a ghost in her own right. Her cottage at the forest's edge, as silent and sealed as any other. Had her secret cure saved her, or had she too succumbed, her dark knowledge dying with her? And what of Mary and her hidden shepherd, Thomas? Their cottage remained a blank, impenetrable void. If their desperate love story continued, it did so in a silence so profound as to be indistinguishable from death itself. In this maelstrom, their small, personal drama was but a single, lost whisper. The winter landscape, once a thing of stark beauty, now seemed only to reflect the desolation within. The snow, so pure, so white, was a deceptive shroud over a village teeming with corruption. The skeletal trees, their branches black against the gray sky, were like a vast, silent congregation of mourners. The wind, as it howled through the empty dwellings, seemed to carry the faint, collective sigh of all the souls that had been lost. The plague had passed through. Yes, like a great, dark wave cresting and then beginning, almost imperceptibly, to recede, not because it was defeated, but because, perhaps, there were simply fewer lives left for it to claim. It had feasted, and now it rested, but the devastation it left in its wake was absolute. Our village was a shell, its heart torn out, its spirit broken. We were a remnant, a handful of scattered survivors in a landscape of death, left to wander the ruins of our world, to confront the terrible silence, and to wonder, in the frozen depths of our souls, what, if anything, could possibly come next. The great wave of the pestilence, having crested and crashed over our tormented village, had begun, almost imperceptibly, to recede, not with the clemency of a departing storm, but with the sullen withdrawal of a glutted beast, leaving in its wake a landscape picked clean, a silence so profound it felt like the very breath of the world had been stolen. The snow still fell, a soft, indifferent counterpane over the unburied dead, over the sealed tombs of cottages, over the frozen remnants of our lives. More than half our number were gone, Perhaps 3/4. Perhaps more. There was no one left to count. No one with the will to know for certain. We, the scattered few who still drew breath in that blighted place, were like solitary, frost-bitten leaves clinging to a dead branch, each gust of wind a threat, each dawn a stark miracle of unwanted survival, in this hollowed-out existence, where the primary struggle was for the next mouthful of scavenged food, the next armful of firewood to keep the encroaching ice at bay. Thoughts of spiritual matters, of God, of faith, had become a distant, almost alien concept. Yet, there was one figure whose absence, whose silence, began to resonate with a peculiar and final desolation. Father Thomas. The church, that gray stone edifice that had once stood as the unshakable heart of our community, now loomed like a forgotten sepulchre at the edge of the deserted village square. Its bell, whose voice had chronicled our joys, our sorrows, and then our daily descent into hell, had long since fallen silent. Its silence was a statement more profound than any sermon, a testament to the utter futility of prayer in the face of such overwhelming, indiscriminate annihilation. I had not seen Father Thomas for weeks, perhaps months. Time had lost its conventional markers. He, like so many others, had been swallowed by the silence, presumed lost to the sickness or to the despair that was its own kind of fatal contagion. One day, driven by a gnawing emptiness in my belly that had become a constant companion, I found myself near the church. My furtive search for overlooked stores, for anything edible that might have been hoarded and then abandoned, had led me to the small, dilapidated priest's cottage that stood in the churchyard's shadow. It was as silent and sealed as all the others, its windows dark, its door barred from within by a thick plank of wood. I recognized as having once been part of the altar rail. He was inside. Then, or his remains were, a strange compulsion, perhaps a vestige of some deeply ingrained, forgotten piety, or maybe just the morbid curiosity of a soul that had witnessed too much horror to be easily deterred, drew me around to the back of the church itself. It was a place I had not been since childhood, a neglected patch of ground where the graveyard, already overflowing, gave way to a tangle of frozen brambles and wine-stunted rowan trees. And it was there that I saw it. A sight that, even after all I had endured, all the horrors that had been seared into my memory, possessed the power to stop my heart, to freeze the very marrow in my bones. Piled haphazardly against the cold, uncaring stone of the church's north wall, half covered by a fresh dusting of snow, lay the bodies of children. Small, fragile forms, some wrapped crudely in scraps of blanket or sacking, others exposed to the elements, their tiny limbs contorted in the final, undignified postures of death. There were perhaps a dozen of them. Perhaps more. Their presence an unspeakable desecration of this supposedly sacred space. Empty cradles had given way to this eternal heap of innocence, abandoned at the very feet of a silent God. They were the unburied, the unmourned, the final, terrible evidence of a community that had not just collapsed, but had been utterly pulverized, its most sacred duties, its most fundamental human responses, extinguished by an agony too great to bear. These were the children for whom no parent had possessed the strength, or the will, or perhaps even the sanity, to provide a pyre in the forest or a shallow grave in the frozen earth. And so, in a last, desperate act of, what? Faith, surrender, accusation, they had been brought here, to the house of God, and left. As I stood there, rooted to the spot by a horror that transcended words, a movement caught my eye. From the small, arched doorway of the sacristy, a figure emerged, stooped and spectral in the gray light. It was Father Thomas, but it was a Father Thomas the first barely recognized. His once sturdy frame was skeletal, his cassock hanging upon him like a shroud. His hair, once neatly tonsured, was now a wild, matted tangle, streaked with gray, But it was his face, his eyes, that held the true measure of his undoing. They were vacant, hollowed out, reflecting not the sorrow of a shepherd for his lost flock, but the flat, dead emptiness of a soul that had gazed too long into the abyss and found the abyss gazing back, and found nothing there, nothing at all. He saw the pile of frozen children. He did not start, nor weep, nor make the sign of the cross. He simply stood and looked, his face devoid of any discernible emotion, as if he were observing a pile of discarded logs, or stones, or any other inanimate, meaningless debris. He stood there for a long time, the falling snow dusting his threadbare shoulders, and then, slowly, he turned and shuffled back into the shadows of the sacristy, leaving the small bodies to the wind and the winter. It was in that moment, watching him, that I understood the whispers I had heard in my own heart about the silence of God. The futility of faith were now given a terrible, human form. This was not merely a priest overwhelmed by grief or weakened by sickness. This was a man whose spiritual foundations had been utterly demolished. The sight of those children, piled like refuse behind his church, must have been the final, unbearable blow, the ultimate refutation of every prayer he had ever uttered, every sacrament he had ever administered, every word of comfort he had ever offered. How could one speak of a loving God, of a divine plan, of meaning or mercy, in the face of such an abomination? The God he had served, the God he had preached, had either abandoned us, or had never existed at all. From that day forward, Father Thomas embraced a silence more profound than any the village had yet known. He did not emerge from the church again. Not that I saw, but the silence that emanated from that cold stone building was no longer merely the absence of bells or sermons. It was the silence of a faith expired, of a priest who had forgotten how to pray, because prayer itself had become a hollow mockery. He was, in essence, as dead as the countless bodies that lay unburied in our village, his soul entombed within the crumbling edifice of his own shattered beliefs. His descent into this voiceless oblivion was, in its own way, more chilling than the physical deaths that surrounded us, for it signified the death of meaning, the final extinguishment of any hope, however faint, that our suffering served some higher purpose, or that there was a divine presence that witnessed and cared about our plight. If God's own chosen servant had been abandoned, or had abandoned God, what hope was there for the rest of us? The ordinary, terrified remnants of a forsaken flock, the church itself began to decay more rapidly, mirroring the spiritual decay of its custodian. Snow drifted through the broken windows, piling on the altar. The wind sighed through its empty nave, a mournful, godless dirge. The small, frozen bodies behind its north wall remained, a constant, silent accusation, their presence a testament to a faith that had failed, to a shepherd who had lost his way not in the wilderness of the world, but in the far more terrible wilderness of a soul stripped bare of its convictions. I thought of all the prayers that had been offered within those walls, the generations of baptisms, weddings, funerals, the countless pleas for deliverance, for mercy, for understanding. All of it now seemed like a vast, collective delusion, a child's frightened whistling in an infinite, uncaring darkness. The priest who had forgotten how to pray was the ultimate symbol of our desolation. He was the final closed door, the ultimate empty cradle, the final ash cooling on a wind that whispered of nothing but oblivion. His silence was the true amen to our village's tragic story, a benediction of despair upon a world that God himself, it seemed, had utterly and irrevocably forsaken. The silence that had claimed our village was now its most defining feature. It was a silence deeper than the snow that blanketed the lanes, more profound than the frozen stillness of the old wood under its winter mantle. It was the silence of cessation, of lives extinguished, of stories abruptly ended. The wind, when it sighed through the gaps in the dilapidated cottages, seemed to carry no whispers of the dead anymore, for the dead were now the overwhelming majority, their presence an accepted, if horrifying, norm. The few of us who still moved through this frozen necropolis were like solitary insects, scuttling across a vast, indifferent tombstone, our own small sounds of survival, the crunch of boots on snow, the desperate chop of an axe into frozen wood amplified, almost shockingly loud in the pervasive emptiness. The plague, in its most virulent form, had indeed passed through, but it had left behind a world scoured not just of life, but of the very structures that had once defined it. Faith was a hollow echo in a desecrated church, its priest a silent, broken man. Community was a forgotten word, each survivor an isolated atom of fear and suspicion. The forest pyres had long since cooled, their ashes scattered and buried under fresh snows, not because there were no more dead, but because there was no one left with the strength, or the will, or the need, to perform even that grim, pragmatic ritual. The dead now lay where they fell, within the sealed confines of their homes, their passing unremarked, their bodies slowly surrendering to the inevitable embrace of the cold and the encroaching decay. It was on one of my increasingly perilous excursions for firewood, for the small store I had hoarded was dwindling to almost nothing, and the cold was a relentless, insidious enemy that I stumbled upon a sign of life where I had long assumed none existed. It was a cottage set back from the main lane, smaller than most, its roof sagging precariously under the weight of accumulated snow. I had passed it many times, dismissing it as another empty shell, another silent tomb. But this day, a thin, almost invisible tendril of smoke, pale gray against the leaden sky, curled hesitantly from its crudely patched chimney. My first instinct was fear, sharp and visceral. Another survivor, a potential threat, or perhaps someone in the final throes of the sickness, their fevered body generating a desperate, illusionary warmth. Caution warred with a flicker of something else, something I had thought long dead within me, a vestige of human curiosity, perhaps even a desperate, irrational yearning for contact, however ill-advised. I approached with the stealth of a hunted animal, my axe held ready, my senses straining for any sound, any sign. The cottage was in a deplorable state. Its single window was boarded over with mismatched pieces of wood, the gaps stuffed with rags. The door, though closed, looked flimsy, ill-fitting, but the smoke, faint as it was undeniable, and as I drew closer, I heard a sound that was almost as shocking as the sight of the smoke, a low, rhythmic chopping, a desperate, hacking noise, followed by the crack of splintering wood. I found a vantage point behind a snowdrift that offered a partial view through a small, ice-crusted gap in the boarded window. What I saw within clutched at my heart with an icy hand. A scene of such stark, poignant desperation that it momentarily eclipsed my own gnawing fear. Inside the dim, frigid interior, illuminated by the weak, struggling flames of a tiny fire in the hearth, was a boy. He could not have been more than 10 or 12 winters old, though his face was etched with a weariness and a grim determination that belonged to a man thrice his age. He was small for his years, his clothes tattered and insufficient against the biting cold that I could feel seeping even into my own well-wrapped form. In his hands, he wielded a small hatchet, bringing it down with a desperate, focused energy onto what looked like the leg of a broken stool. Splinters flew, and with each successful chop, he would gather the pieces and feed them to the struggling fire. And then I saw her, lying on a low pallet near the hearth, covered by a motley collection of rags and what looked like a tattered tapestry, was an old woman, her grandmother, I presumed. Her face was skeletal, her skin the color of old parchment, stretched taut over prominent bones. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow and uneven. A faint, rasping sound in the otherwise silent room. She was gravely ill, clearly dying. though whether from the lingering touch of the pestilence, or from the simple, brutal attrition of cold and starvation, I could not tell. The boy worked with a silent, almost ferocious intensity. His gaze flickered constantly between his task, the fire, and the still form of his grandmother. I watched, hidden and ashamed of my intrusion, yet unable to tear myself away, as he broke apart the stool, then a small, three-legged table, then what appeared to be a wooden chest. Its lid already gone, he was burning their belongings, piece by piece, to keep that pitiful fire alive, to generate a meager warmth in the face of the encroaching, terminal cold. This was not the honest burning of seasoned firewood, nor the horrifying conflagration of the forest pyres. This was a different kind of burning. A desperate, sacrificial alchemy, transmuting the mundane objects of a past life, a stool to sit on, a table to eat at, a chest to store meager treasures into a few more precious moments of warmth, a few more labored breaths for the dying woman on the pallet. Each crack of the hatchet, each offering to the flames, was an act of profound, heartbreaking devotion. I saw him pause, his small shoulders slumped with exhaustion, and go to the old woman's side. He knelt, his movements tender, and tried to spoon a little melted snow, perhaps, or some thin, watery broth, between her unresponsive lips. He smoothed the wisps of gray hair back from her forehead, his touch gentle, his young face a mask of anxious love and an unspoken grief that seemed too vast for his small frame to contain. The term frostbitten mercy came unbidden to my mind. This was what I was witnessing. A mercy born of desperation, harsh and ultimately futile, yet a mercy nonetheless. It was an act of love in a world that had forgotten the meaning of the word. A defiant flicker of humanity in the face of overwhelming, nihilistic despair. He was not merely prolonging her life, though that was surely his intent. He was honoring it, tending its flame to the very last, even as he fed their shared past to the consuming fire. The warmth he generated was as much for her soul, I suspected, as for her failing body. What memories were attached to those objects he was so methodically destroying? The stool, perhaps, where she had sat for countless hours, her hands busy with mending or knitting, her voice, in better days, perhaps humming an old lullaby. The table, witness to shared meals, to stories told, to the small, everyday rituals of a life now all but extinguished. The chest, repository of a lifetime's meager keepsakes, a wedding ribbon, a child's first shoe, a faded letter, all of it now fuel, all of it turning to ash. Just like the lives and hopes of our village. I stayed there for a long time, a silent, unseen witness to their private Gethsemane. The pile of burnable objects dwindled. The room grew colder, the fire struggling more desperately for life. The boy's movements became slower, his small face streaked with soot and, I thought, with tears he did not allow himself to shed. What would he do when the last piece of furniture was gone? When the fire finally died, and the cold, that patient, inexorable assassin, claimed its final victory? And what then for him? A child alone in a dead world, his act of frostbitten mercy complete, his purpose extinguished with his grandmother's last breath. The thought was a fresh stab of pain in my own already numb heart. I had nothing to offer them. My own supplies were perilously low. To reveal myself might only bring further fear, or a desperate, false hope I could not sustain. And the fear of contagion, though perhaps less acute now with so few targets left, was still a powerful deterrent. So I remained hidden, a guilty voyeur, my presence a silent, helpless acknowledgement of their suffering. As dusk began to paint the sky in hues of violet and bruised gray, I slipped away, leaving them to their vigil. The image of the boy, his small figure silhouetted against the struggling flames, feeding their past to the fire to buy a few more fleeting moments of warmth for his dying grandmother, was seared into my mind. It was an image of profound love, of terrible sacrifice, of a mercy so harsh it was almost indistinguishable from cruelty. Yet a mercy it undoubtedly was. In this frostbitten end of all things, it was a reminder, perhaps, that even in the deepest pit of despair, even when humanity seemed to have been utterly consumed by fear and brutality, small, almost invisible acts of profound love and sacrifice could still occur. They did not change the larger tragedy. They did not offer salvation, but they existed. They were faint, almost imperceptible sparks in the overwhelming darkness, testaments to a resilience of the human spirit that even the plague, in all its monstrous fury, could not entirely extinguish. But oh, the cost of such sparks, the terrible, terrible cost. The ashes from that small, desperate fire seemed to mingle with the ashes of my own soul, a shared testament to a world where mercy itself had become a frostbitten, agonizing thing. The silence that followed the episode of the boy and his frostbitten mercy was, if possible, even more profound than what had come before. His small, desperate fire had been a singular point of faint light in an overwhelming darkness, a testament to a love that defied the universal decay. When that light inevitably winked out as I knew it must have, for no smoke rose from that chimney on subsequent days, and the cottage resumed the vacant, tomb-like stillness of its neighbors, it felt as though the last ember of human warmth in our desolate village had finally cooled to ash. We, the scattered, skeletal remnants of a once thriving community, were now truly alone, each in our own frozen circle of hell. The bonds of kinship, of neighborhood, even of shared humanity, had been systematically scoured away by plague, by fear, by the insidious rot of despair. We were like solitary wolves, gaunt and wary, prowling the edges of a wasteland, our only instinct self-preservation, our only companion the gnawing emptiness in our bellies and the echoing void in our souls. The winter showed no sign of relenting, its icy breath a constant reminder of our precarious hold on existence. It was into this landscape of utter desolation, this graveyard of hope, that a new voice arose, and like all things that offered a deviation from the monotonous cadence of our suffering, it commanded a desperate, almost unwilling attention. He was a man named Silas, a tanner by trade in the bygone days, a man of no particular note before the pestilence. He had been a quiet, somewhat dour figure, rarely speaking in communal gatherings, content to ply his malodorous trade at the edge of the village. He had lost his wife and 2 sons early in the plague's onslaught, a tragedy that had seemingly broken him, for he had retreated into his cottage and, like so many others, had been presumed dead or dying. But Silas had not died. He had, it seemed, undergone some terrible, transformative crucible in the solitude of his grief and fear. He emerged one bleak, gray morning, stumbling into the deserted village square, his appearance as shocking as any apparition. He was emaciated, his eyes burning with a feverish, unnatural light in the gaunt hollows of his face. His clothes were tattered, his hair and beard a wild, matted tangle. But it was his voice, when he began to speak, that truly arrested the few of us who happened to witness his resurrection. It was no longer the quiet, unremarkable tone of Silas the tanner. It was resonant, powerful, imbued with an unnerving certainty. I have seen the light, he proclaimed, his voice echoing strangely in the oppressive silence. The Lord has spoken to me in the darkness. He has shown me the path out of this desolation, a path to salvation for his chosen remnant. Shouted into the empty air, seemed at first like the ravings of a lunatic, another soul cracked by the unbearable pressures of our reality. I, who had witnessed Father Thomas' descent into a silence born of shattered faith, felt a cold skepticism. God, salvation, these were words that had lost all meaning, hollow sounds in a world so thoroughly abandoned by any semblance of divine mercy. Yet, to some of the other survivors, perhaps a dozen or so souls as desperate and adrift as myself, Silas' sudden appearance, his fervent declarations, were not so easily dismissed. We were so starved for any flicker of hope, Any semblance of leadership, any narrative that offered an alternative to the slow, grinding attrition of hunger, cold, and despair, that even the words of a madman could find purchase. Father Thomas was gone, a broken symbol of a faith that had failed. The village elders, with their talk of divine punishment, offered no solace, only a deeper sense of damnation. But Silas spoke of a path, of guidance, of salvation. He claimed that God, in a series of visions, had instructed him to lead the faithful few out of our blighted village, to a sanctuary, a hidden valley untouched by the plague, a new Eden where we could rebuild, where we could live free from the shadow of death. He described this promised land in vivid, alluring detail: sun-drenched meadows, clear streams, abundant game. It was a vision so potent, so diametrically opposed to the frozen hell we inhabited, that it was almost impossible not to be swayed, not to want to believe. Slowly, hesitantly, a small, ragged band began to gather round him. There was Martha Cooper, young Thomas' mother, her eyes, once vacant with grief, now holding a desperate, rekindled light. There was John the Thatcher, who had lost his son Will, his broad shoulders now stooped, but a flicker of resolve returning to his face. A few other solitary figures, men and women who had lost everyone, who had nothing left to lose, and, perhaps, a sliver of a desperate hope to gain. I found myself among them, not out of conviction, but out of a weary, cynical curiosity, and perhaps a profound lack of any better alternative. My own small store of foraged food was nearly gone. My strength was waning. To remain alone in my cottage was a slow, certain death. To follow this wild-eyed prophet into the unknown was a quicker, more uncertain one. But at least it was a choice, an action, in a world that had rendered us so utterly passive. Silas, fueled by his visions and the desperate faith of his small flock, began to make preparations. He spoke with an increasingly messianic fervor, his pronouncements growing more grandiose, his demands more exacting. We were to purify ourselves, he said, to cast off all remnants of our old, sinful lives. We were to trust implicitly in his guidance, for he was merely a vessel, an instrument of God's will. The path he spoke of was not an easy one. It led, he claimed, northwards, through the treacherous, snowbound passes of the Blackwood Mountains, a journey that would have been perilous even for seasoned travelers in the best of times. For us, weakened by months of privation, haunted by grief, it seemed an almost suicidal undertaking. But Silas brooked no dissent. Doubt, he thundered, was a sin, a weakness that would deny us entry to the promised land. And so, one bitter dawn, under a sky the color of a fresh bruise, our small, pathetic exodus began. Perhaps 15 souls in all, including Silas. We carried what little we possessed: a few tattered blankets, a handful of scavenged tools, the crushing weight of our memories. The village, as we left it behind, looked even more desolate, more irrevocably dead, its silence pressing in on us like a physical force. The journey was a nightmare from the outset. The snow was deep, the wind relentless, cutting through our inadequate clothing like razors. Silas, striding ahead, his eyes fixed on some distant, invisible horizon, seemed immune to the cold, to the exhaustion that quickly began to claim the rest of us. He would stop periodically, not to allow us to rest, but to deliver impassioned sermons, his voice raw and hoarse, calling on God to sustain us, to smite our enemies, to reveal his path. But God, it seemed, remained as silent as he had been throughout the plague. Tragedy began to stalk our small band almost immediately. Martha Cooper, her strength already sapped by grief and starvation, stumbled and fell, breaking her ankle. She could not go on. Silas, after a moment of cold deliberation, declared that she was being tested, that her faith was insufficient. He offered a perfunctory prayer over her, then ordered us to leave her behind. The look of bewildered betrayal in her eyes as we moved away, her small, despairing cries swallowed by the wind, haunted me for days. Then, John the Thatcher, in a desperate attempt to find shelter from a sudden blizzard, slipped on an icy precipice and plunged into a deep ravine. We heard his single, terrible scream, and then nothing. Silas forbade any attempt at rescue, claiming it was God's judgment, a weeding out of the weak. The promised land remained elusive. The mountain passes were brutal, unforgiving. Our meager supplies dwindled to nothing. 2 more of our numbers succumbed to exposure, their frozen bodies left where they fell. Cairns of our folly, the faith of Silas' followers began to fray, replaced by a dull, mutinous despair. His pronouncements grew wilder, more unhinged. He began to see signs and portents in every gust of wind, every raven's cry, his interpretations increasingly, his demands more tyrannical. The narrator, who had harbored doubts from the beginning, now saw Silas not as a madman touched by God, but as a dangerous delusional, his own profound trauma twisted into a messianic complex that was leading us all to our doom. His eyes, once burning with a seemingly holy fire, now looked merely unhinged, his certainty the bluster of a man terrified of his own dawning. Internal emptiness. The final tragedy struck when we were, by Silas' frantic calculation, on the very cusp of his promised valley. We had descended into a narrow, wooded defile, exhausted, starving, and on the verge of open rebellion. It was there that we were ambushed, not by the plague, not by the elements, but by other men, desperate men, like ourselves, perhaps, driven from their own blighted villages, their humanity stripped away by starvation, their eyes holding the same feral gleam that I sometimes glimpsed in my own reflection. They fell upon us with crude weapons, seeking not our souls, but what little we possessed: our ragged clothes, our worn-out boots, the last scraps of moldy bread. Silas, confronted by this brutal, earthly violence, seemed to deflate, his prophetic fire extinguished in an instant. He offered no divine protection, no rallying cry. He merely whimpered, a terrified, broken man, and was among the first to fall. A crude spear thrust through his chest. The rest of us scattered, fleeing into the merciless forest, the sounds of slaughter, of desperate cries, echoing behind us. I do not know how many survived that final, bloody betrayal of hope. I ran, blind with terror, until I could run no more, until I collapsed, alone and bleeding from a shallow wound, in the snow. The false prophet was dead. His promised land had been a mirage, his divine guidance a path to further, more brutal suffering. He had offered a desperate, flickering candle in our darkness, but it had been a treacherous light, luring us onto the rocks. The tragedy he had promised to lead us from had merely spread, amplified by his delusion, by our own desperate, foolish willingness to believe. As I lay there, the taste of blood and snow in my mouth, the silence of the indifferent forest pressing in, I understood that there was no easy salvation, no divinely ordained path out of the hell we inhabited. There was only the cold, hard reality of survival, and the bitter ashes of a hope that had been, from its very inception, a cruel and terrible lie. I returned to the skeletal remains of our village, a ghost among ghosts, the taste of ashes from the false prophet's deceit still bitter in my mouth. The disastrous exodus he had orchestrated had achieved nothing but to scatter the few, desperate survivors further, to deliver more souls into the greedy, waiting maw of starvation, exposure, or violence. How many had perished in that ill-fated flight? I could not say. I had fled the final, bloody ambush alone, driven by the primal instinct to survive, an instinct that now felt more like a curse than a blessing, condemning me to witness the protracted death throes of a world I had once called home. The village, if it was possible, was even more silent, more utterly forsaken than when we had left it. The fresh snows of the intervening days had partially covered the tracks of our pathetic departure, as if nature itself were attempting to erase the memory of our foolish, fleeting hope. The doors of the cottages remained sealed, immutable in their silent testament to the horrors within, or gaping open like vacant maws, their secrets long since plundered by the wind and the cold. The oppressive silence was a physical entity, a smothering blanket that absorbed all sound, all breath, all thought. It was then that I began to notice them. The crows. At first, there were only a few. Dark sentinels perched on the ridgepoles of the abandoned dwellings, their guttural calls echoing strangely in the frozen stillness. But their numbers grew with each passing day, as if word had spread through their black-feathered nation that a great feast was to be had. Or rather, that a kingdom was finally, irrevocably, falling. They were not the scattered, opportunistic scavengers I had known before. This was an occupation, an invasion. They congregated, with a particular and unnerving preference, around the church, the gray stone edifice, its windows dark and broken like the eye sockets of a skull, its bell silent for so long, now seemed to serve as their parliament, their fortress. They swarmed its roof, a constantly shifting, iridescent black carpet against the dull gray slates. They perched on the crumbling parapets, on the weathered stone cross that still, by some miracle, clung to the apex of the nave. Their harsh, cacophonous cries filled the air, a raucous, mocking chorus that replaced the lost voices of the choir, the absent murmur of prayer, the vanished tolling of the bell. The belfry, that tall, stone tower that had once housed the village's resonant bronze tongue, became their particular domain. They wheeled around it in great, dark flocks, their wings beating a heavy rhythm against the air. They jostled for perches in its arched openings, their black forms silhouetted against the pale, winter sky, like grotesque, feathered gargoyles. It was as if they were claiming it, anointing it with their wild, untamed presence, transforming a symbol of human faith into a monument of nature's grim, indifferent ascendancy. I watched them from the comparative safety of my own wretched hovel, a strange fascination mingling with my fear. They were creatures of omen, of death, their presence a stark visual confirmation of what I already knew in my soul. Our village was finished, its human story at an end. These were the new inheritors, the scavengers picking over the bones of our dead civilization. Then, one afternoon, as a weak, watery sun cast long, mournful shadows across the snow, it happened. A sound so unexpected, so out of place in that profound and deathly silence, that it struck me with the force of a physical blow, making my heart leap into my throat. The bell. A single, solitary toll. It was not the clear, resonant chime of old. It was a strange, cracked sound, weak and hesitant, yet unmistakably the voice of the church bell, a voice I had thought extinguished forever. It echoed out over the snow-covered graves, over the sealed cottages, over the crow-haunted church, a single, mournful, questioning note in the vast, uncaring silence. My breath caught. Who? What? How? My mind raced, a flurry of impossible explanations. Had Father Thomas, in some final, lucid moment, stirred from his catatonic despair and found the strength to pull that heavy rope one last time? Was it some other desperate survivor, hidden away like myself, making a final, despairing signal to a world that no longer listened? Or was it something less human, the groaning collapse of the ancient timbers within the belfry? A fortuitous gust of wind catching the lip of the bell just so. Or perhaps even the accumulated weight and frantic movement of the crows themselves, accidentally nudging the mechanism into a fleeting, ghostly life. I would never know. I dared not venture closer to investigate. The church, under its new, black-feathered dominion, felt more alien, more dangerous than ever before. But the impact of that single, unexpected toll was profound. It was as if the village itself, in its death throes, had managed to draw one final, ragged breath, to utter one last, mournful word before succumbing to eternal silence. It was a sound freighted with all our lost history, all our vanished hopes, all our unutterable sorrows. It was the voice of every birth, every marriage, every death that Bell had ever chronicled, condensed into one heartbreaking, ephemeral note. The crows, startled by the sudden sound, rose from the belfry in a great, clamorous cloud, their panicked caws momentarily drowning out the fading resonance of the bronze. They wheeled in agitated circles above the church, a vortex of black against the gray, before slowly, hesitantly, beginning to settle once more, their raucous voices gradually subsiding into an uneasy, watchful quiet. And then the silence returned. But it was different now. It was heavier, more absolute, imbued with a terrible finality. That single, cracked toll had not been a call to prayer, nor a promise of resurrection. It had been a full stop, an epitaph, the very last word. A chilling certainty settled upon me, cold and heavy as the tombstones in the churchyard. That was it. The last bell. There would be no other. There was no one left with the strength, with the will, with the reason, to make it speak again. Father Thomas was a broken vessel, his faith shattered, his body likely succumbing to the neglect that mirrored his spiritual emptiness. The few other souls who might still draw a breath in this forsaken place were too consumed by their own grim struggle for survival, too isolated, too steeped in despair, to even contemplate such an act. The mechanism of our communal voice, the ringer of our collective joys and sorrows, was now and forever silent. The village had finally, truly, lost its tongue. The crows resettled, their dark forms once again encrusting the belfry, their intermittent, guttural cries now the only sound to disturb the profound stillness. They were the new choir, the new congregation, the new guardians of this desolate, godless place. They picked at the crumbling mortar, their sharp eyes missing nothing, their presence a constant, living memento mori. I sat in my hovel, the echo of that last, ghostly toll reverberating in the chambers of my memory, and a desolation deeper than any I had yet known washed over me. It was the desolation of utter finality. The plague had taken our bodies, fear had taken our community, despair had taken our souls, and now, this last bell, this single, fragile sound, had marked the passing of our very memory, the erasure of our collective story from the annals of the living world. We were a whisper now, a fading echo, a scattering of ashes on an indifferent wind. The crows in the belfry were our only mourners, their harsh caws our only requiem, and the silence they presided over was the silence of a world utterly and irrevocably undone. The last bell had tolled, and its sound was the sound of the void. The silence that had followed the last, ghostly toll of the church bell was different. It was not the taut, expectant silence of fear, nor the shocked hush of immediate grief. It was the silence of finality, of a story told, a chapter closed, a world irrevocably ended. The crows, those black-feathered inheritors of our desolation, still held dominion over the church belfry, their harsh cries the only sporadic punctuation in an otherwise unbroken stillness. But even their voices seemed to have lost some of their raucous mockery, settling into a more monotonous, almost proprietary cawing, as if they too had accepted the profound and unchanging emptiness of their new kingdom. And then, after an age of ice and shadows, an age measured not in days or weeks, but in the slow accumulation of sorrow, and the relentless subtraction of souls, something shifted. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, a change in the quality of the light. Perhaps, a faint dilution of the oppressive gray that had been our constant companion, a subtle softening in the bite of the wind, which now carried less of the sharp, stinging ice and more a damp, earthy chill. And then, the unmistakable sound, the slow, hesitant drip of water. Drip. 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 From the eaves of my wretched hovel. From the bare branches of the skeletal trees. From the icicles that had hung like fangs from the decaying roofs of the abandoned cottages. It was the sound of the thaw. Winter. That great, white beast that had held us captive in its frozen jaws for so long, was finally, reluctantly, beginning to loosen its grip. For weeks, perhaps months for time, as I knew it, had ceased to have meaning. I had not ventured beyond the immediate, desperate necessity of scrounging for enough firewood to prevent myself from freezing solid. My world had shrunk to the four walls of my cottage, to the dwindling embers of my hearth, to the gnawing emptiness in my belly, and the even greater emptiness in my soul. The village outside, the world outside, was a place of ghosts and unimaginable horrors, a place I had no desire, no courage, to confront. But the sound of the melting snow, that persistent, gentle percussion, worked on me like a slow-acting antidote to the paralysis of fear. It was the sound of change, of movement, in a world that had been locked in stasis for an eternity. It stirred within me not hope, for hope was a luxury I had long since renounced, but a primal, irresistible urge, an urge to see, to know, to witness the full extent of the devastation that the winter and the pestilence had wrought. Now that the deceptive white shroud was being drawn back, the decision to leave my shelter was not born of courage, but of a weary, almost fatalistic curiosity. What more could I lose? What further horror could this world reveal that I had not already witnessed or imagined? And so, one morning, when the dripping from the eaves had become a steady, almost musical trickle, and a pale, watery sun attempted to pierce the thinning clouds, I unbarred my door. The air that met me was still cold, but it carried a new scent, the smell of damp earth, of decaying leaves, of wet stone, all overlaid with the faint, lingering miasma of death that had become the permanent perfume of our village. I stepped out, my legs stiff and unsteady from disuse, my eyes blinking against even that weak, diffuse light. The village was a ruin. The snow, in its melting, revealed the true extent of our desolation with a brutal, unsparing clarity. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and the corpse beneath, once softened and obscured by a gentle white shroud, was now exposed in all its putrefying horror. Lanes that had been smooth, silent rivers of white were now treacherous gullies of mud and slush, littered with debris, broken household items, sodden rags, the gnawed bones of some unfortunate animal. Cottages that had seemed merely sealed and silent under their mantle of snow now revealed themselves as truly derelict. Roofs had collapsed further under the weight of the melt. Doors hung askew on broken hinges, or had fallen away entirely, revealing the dark, refuse-strewn interiors. Some walls had begun to crumble, the wattle and daub dissolving into mud, the timber frames exposed like the ribs of a decaying carcass. And the bodies, the melting snow uncovered them. Those who had died alone in the lanes, their passing unremarked. Those who had been left in hastily dug, shallow graves, now exposed by the shifting earth. And those, the uncounted many, who lay within the cottages, their presence hinted at by the swarms of fat, buzzing flies that congregated around broken windows or gaps in the walls. Their low, ominous hum, a new and sickening addition to the village's soundscape. The stench of decay, once partially suppressed by the frost, now rose to meet the damp spring air. A cloying, inescapable reminder of the pestilence's ghastly triumph. I walked, slowly, hesitantly, through this landscape of utter ruin. My feet slipped in the mud. My breath hitched in my throat. This was my home. These were the streets I had walked since childhood, the houses where I had known friends, neighbors, family. Now, it was a boneyard, a testament to a catastrophe so complete it beggared description. The church still stood, its stone walls streaked with meltwater, looking darker, more forlorn than ever. The crows still held their court in the belfry, their numbers perhaps slightly thinned, their caws echoing with a hollow, proprietary sound. I did not venture to the back of the church, to where the small, frozen bodies of the children had lain. I could not bear to see what the thaw might have revealed there. The memory alone was a wound that would never heal. Father Thomas' cottage was a ruin among ruins, its doors splintered, its interior dark and silent. Had he finally found his peace there, his silent protest ended by the simple cessation of breath, or had he wandered away, a mad, hollow man, into the wilderness? I would never know. His story, like so many others, had dissolved into the vast, uncaring silence. And what of Mary and her shepherd, Thomas? In their attic of desperate love, their cottage, when I passed it, was as silent and sealed as any tomb. Had their love, that dangerous, flickering flame, been enough to see them through? Or had their secret sanctuary become their shared grave? The mud around their door was undisturbed. No smoke rose from their chimney. The silence from within was absolute, indistinguishable from the silence of all the other charnel houses that lined the lane. Yet, amidst this overwhelming desolation, this tableau of human defeat, there were other signs. Small, almost imperceptible at first, but there nonetheless, as the snow receded, bearing the bruised and battered earth. Tiny, tentative shoots of green were beginning to appear. Grass. Stubborn, tenacious, indifferent grass, pushing its way up through the cracks in the cobblestones, around the foundations of the ruined cottages. Even, I imagined, in the unhallowed ground where the dead lay unburied. Small, hardy weeds, their leaves a vibrant, almost shocking green against the gray and brown of the decaying village, were unfurling in sheltered corners. The buds on the skeletal branches of the hawthorn at the edge of the square, which I had thought dead, now looked swollen, pregnant with the promise of new leaf. A lone snowdrop, impossibly white and pure, bloomed bravely in the lee of a fallen wall, its delicate bell a silent counterpoint to the long-stilled church bell. Nature, in its relentless, impersonal cycle, was moving on. It was reclaiming its own, indifferent to our human tragedies, to our vanished lives, our forgotten stories. This burgeoning green, this stubborn resurgence of life, was not for us. It was simply what happened when the iron grip of winter loosened, when the sun, however weak, returned. It was beautiful, in a stark, heartbreaking way, and it was terrible, for it underscored, with a quiet, irrefutable finality, our own insignificance, our own impermanence. The silence of the village was different now. It was no longer the taut, fear-filled silence of the plague's reign, nor the stunned, hollow silence of its immediate aftermath. It was the silence of utter emptiness, the silence of abandonment, punctuated not by human groans or the tolling of a bell, but by the drip of meltwater, the caw of a distant crow, the faint, almost inaudible rustle of new life stirring in the damp earth. I stood in the center of what had once been our bustling village square, now a muddy, desolate expanse, and I was, perhaps, the only human soul left to witness this transformation. The sense of solitude was overwhelming, a physical weight that pressed down on me, more suffocating than any locked door. I was the last man, or one of the last, in a dead world. The silence was not just around me, it was within me. A vast, echoing emptiness where grief, fear, and even memory had begun to lose their sharp edges, worn smooth by the relentless tide of loss. The thaw had come, and with it, a reckoning. The full horror of what we had endured was laid bare, stripped of winter's deceptive shroud. But with it, too, came the first, faint, indifferent stirrings of a world that would continue, with or without us. After the silence of death, came the silence of utter desolation, and the quiet, relentless murmur of nature's remorseless, beautiful, and terrifying renewal. The days that followed my first ventures back into the thawing, desolate heart of our village were a blur of grim foraging and profound, echoing solitude. The melt had laid bare the full, unsparing horror of what the winter and the pestilence had wrought. Each crumbling cottage, each silent, debris-strewn lane, was a fresh testament to our annihilation. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying wood, and the lingering, phantom sweetness of corruption, was a constant reminder of the unburied dead, of the life that had been so brutally extinguished. Nature, in its indifferent majesty, was beginning its slow reclamation, with stubborn grasses pushing through the mud and hardy weeds unfurling their leaves in the ruins. But this burgeoning green felt less like a promise of renewal and more like a quiet, final assertion of its ultimate dominion over our fallen human endeavors. It was during one such foray, driven by the gnawing need for anything that might serve as fuel or food, that I found myself at the far western edge of the village. A cluster of smaller cottages I had not often frequented even in better times. Most were in a state of advanced decay, their roofs caved in, their walls crumbling, but one, set back slightly from the others, shielded by a ragged line of skeletal fruit trees, seemed different. Its small shutters were closed, but intact. The door, though weathered, was still firmly in its frame, and around it, in a small, enclosed patch of earth that had once, perhaps, been a kitchen garden, there was a sense of order. Not the vibrant order of a tended garden, but rather the ghost of one. The earth within the low stone border was dark and recently thawed, and pushing through the damp soil were rows upon rows of tiny, impossibly green shoots, seedlings, small, fragile, yet undeniably alive, reaching for the weak, watery sunlight with a tenacity that seemed almost defiant in this landscape of universal death. My heart, a cold, shriveled knot in my chest, gave an unfamiliar flutter. Who could have done this? Who, amidst the unrelenting horror of the plague's reign, would have possessed the foresight, the hope, the sheer, stubborn will, to sow seeds for a future they would almost certainly never see? Driven by a curiosity that momentarily overrode my ingrained caution, I pushed open the cottage door. It was not locked, merely latched, and swung inward with a protesting groan. The interior was small, dim, and cold, yet remarkably tidy. Not lived in, but rather preserved. A simple wooden table stood in the center of the single room. A rough-hewn stool beside it. A narrow pallet lay in one corner, neatly covered with a faded, patched quilt. There was no sign of recent occupation, no scent of life or death, only the chill of abandonment and the faint, dry smell of old herbs. And then I saw it. Lying on the small wooden table, beside a collection of carefully saved seed packets fashioned from scraps of parchment, was a book. Not a printed book, for such things were rare and precious, but a small, leather-bound volume, its pages filled with a neat, looping script. A diary. With trembling hands, I picked it up. The leather was worn smooth with handling. A simple leather thong held it closed. I fumbled with the knot, my fingers clumsy, my heart pounding with an emotion I could not name. Anticipation, dread, a profound and sorrowful reverence. The first entry was dated in the late autumn of the previous year, just as the first whispers of the plague had begun to reach our isolated village. The handwriting was unmistakably that of a young woman, perhaps a girl on the cusp of adulthood. Her name, I learned from a later entry, was Alara. Not Alara the blacksmith's daughter, whose laughter had been silenced so long ago, but another Alara, a quieter soul, it seemed, one whose existence had largely passed beneath my notice in the bustling life of the village before. October. The 10th day, the first entry read, "The ink faded but still legible. The wind carries a chill from the south today. And with it, strange tales. Father worries, though he tries to hide it. I have gathered the last of the apples. The seeds from the best ones I will save. Winter will be long, but spring always returns. Does it not?" The silence of the small cottage pressing in around me, broken only by the rustle of the turning pages and the frantic beating of my own heart. I read for hours, a voyeur into a life that had unfolded in parallel to our collective descent into hell, yet had maintained its own quiet, stubborn focus. Alara's diary was not a chronicle of the plague's horrors, though they were mentioned, inevitably, with a growing sense of fear and sorrow. The sickness had claimed her parents early, leaving her alone in the small cottage. But the core of her entries, the thread that bound them together, was her garden, her seeds. November, the 3rd day. The snows have begun. They say the sickness is in the next village. I have sorted my seeds today. Parsley, thyme, and a few precious beans Father brought back from the market town last summer. I will keep them dry by the hearth. They are little promises. The 15th day. The bell tolls so often now. Young Thomas Cooper is gone. His mother weeps. It is hard to feel the sun, even when it shines. I have drawn a plan for my spring garden in the dirt on the hearthstone. Rows for the beans, a place for the herbs. It is a small thing, but it feels right. Her small triumphs, how she had bartered a piece of her mother's lace for a handful of turnip seeds from a passing peddler, before even the peddlers had ceased to come. How she had painstakingly enriched the soil of her small plot with leaf mold gathered from the edge of the old wood. Her trips there increasingly fraught with danger as the village succumbed to fear and isolation. How she had protected her precious seeds from mice, from damp, from the despair that threatened to engulf her. January, the 20th day. The fires burn in the forest now. The smell is terrible. I keep my shutters closed. Today, I whispered to my seeds. I told them they must be strong. I told them spring will come. I am not sure I believe it myself anymore. But the seeds, they do not know of despair. The handwriting sometimes faltering. As the winter deepened and the plague tightened its grip, there were mentions of her own growing weakness, of the dwindling supplies of food and firewood. But always, she returned to her garden, to her seeds. February, the last day. I am so tired. The coughing is worse. But today, I felt a stirring, not in my heart, for that is cold, but in the earth. I think the frost is less keen. Soon, it will be time. I must be ready. The script wavering, almost illegible. March, the 7th day. I have planted them, all of them, in the cold earth. A prayer for something green. Life. Remember the sentence trailed off, unfinished. I closed the diary, my eyes blurring with tears I had thought long since frozen within me. Alara, a girl I had barely known, yet whose quiet courage, whose stubborn, desperate faith in the simple act of planting a seed, now filled me with a profound and aching sorrow, and something else, something akin to awe. I rose and went to the small, shuttered window, unlatching it and pushing it open. The weak sunlight, filtered through the bare branches of the fruit trees, fell upon the small, enclosed patch of earth outside, and there they were. Her legacy, her prayer. Tiny green shoots, fragile and yet fiercely alive, pushing their way up through the cold, damp soil. Rows of them. Beans. Perhaps. The feathery tops of carrots or parsley. the unmistakable spear-like leaves of an early crocus, a splash of defiant purple in the monochrome world. They were so small, so vulnerable, yet they lived. They had weathered the end of the world. Sheltered in the frozen earth, nurtured by the dreams of a dying girl. I stood there for a long time. The cool, damp air on my face, the scent of wet earth and new growth, a strange counterpoint to the lingering miasma of death that still clung to the village. The silence here was different. It was not the silence of despair, but the quiet, expectant hush of a garden waiting to grow. Alara's garden, the garden she had left behind. It was such a small thing. A tiny patch of cultivated earth in a world consumed by chaos and decay. And yet, it felt like the most significant thing I had encountered since the plague had begun. It was not a promise of salvation, not a sign that our world would be miraculously restored. The dead were still dead. The village was still a ruin. My own future was as uncertain and as bleak as ever. But these small, green lives, born of one girl's solitary, defiant hope, were a testament to the enduring power of life, to the quiet courage of the human spirit, to the simple, profound act of planting a seed in the darkness, believing, against all evidence, in the possibility of a spring that might never come for oneself, but might, just might, dawn for something else. I did not know what I would do. My own survival was a day-to-day, moment-to-moment struggle, but as I looked at those fragile green shoots, I felt a stirring within me, a faint, unfamiliar sensation, not hope, perhaps, not yet, but a sense of responsibility, a need to protect this small, improbable legacy. Alara had planted her seeds as a prayer, and in the desolate silence of our dead village, her prayer, it seemed, had been answered. The seedlings lived, and in their fragile, tenacious life, perhaps, just perhaps, there was a whisper of a different kind of future. A future that might one day grow, however slowly, however painfully, from the ashes of our ruined world. The garden Alara left behind became my unwilling sanctuary, my silent, fragile anchor in a world otherwise adrift in death and decay. Her small, hopeful seedlings, pushing with such tenacious, vibrant green from the cold, dark earth, were a daily miracle, a quiet rebuke to the overwhelming despair that had become my constant companion. I found myself tending to them, my actions clumsy and untutored at first, driven by a sense of obligation to her memory, to the improbable courage captured in her faded diary. I cleared the encroaching weeds with hesitant hands, brought water in a cracked pitcher from the now steadily flowing stream that fed the village well, and watched, with a strange, detached wonder, as the tiny plants grew, unfurling new leaves, reaching towards a sun that seemed, day by day, to grow a little warmer, a little brighter. Spring was no longer a distant rumor, a half-forgotten dream. It was asserting itself with a gentle but undeniable force. The oppressive gray mantle that had shrouded our skies for so long began to break apart, revealing astonishing, breathtaking patches of blue, a blue so clear, so vibrant. It felt like a color I had never truly seen before, or had forgotten in the long winter of our sorrow. The air, once sharp with frost and the stench of ash and corruption, now carried the sweet, damp scent of thawing earth, of budding leaves, of rain-washed stone. Bird song, tentative at first, then growing in confidence and complexity, began to thread through the silence, not the harsh cawing of the crows, who still held their sombre court around the church, but the cheerful, intricate melodies of robins and finches, returning to a world they perhaps found strangely, blessedly empty of human clamor. The snow had all but vanished from the lower village, lingering only in the deepest shadows and on the distant, brooding peaks of the Blackwood Mountains. The lanes were rivers of mud. Yes, but even the mud seemed alive, teeming with unseen stirrings. The skeletal trees that lined them were no longer stark and lifeless of fate. Almost imperceptible green haze softened their grim silhouettes as tiny buds swelled and broke. It was on a day such as this, when the blue of the sky was a profound ache in its beauty, and the air hummed with the quiet energy of renewal, that I saw him. I had ventured further than usual from Alara's cottage, driven by the need to scavenge for something more substantial than the few edible roots I had managed to dig from the edge of the forest. My path took me past the ruins of the village square, past the silent, decaying church, towards a cluster of cottages on the eastern side, dwellings I had long assumed were as empty and death-filled as all the others. And then I saw the smoke. Not the pale, hesitant smoke I coaxed from my own meager fires, nor the greasy, black smoke of the long-dead forest pyres. This was a thin, steady blue-gray plume, rising from a chimney that, while dilapidated, was still largely intact, a sign of life, of another. My heart, which I had thought capable of no emotion stronger than a dull, persistent ache, began to hammer against my ribs with a violence that was almost painful. Fear, sharp and instinctive, was my first response, the ingrained terror of months spent equating human contact with danger, with contagion, with betrayal. I ducked behind the crumbling remains of a stone wall, my hand reaching for the axe that was my constant companion, my eyes straining, every nerve ending alive with a terrible, prickling apprehension. A figure emerged from the cottage. A man. Gaunt. Yes. His clothes ragged, his hair long and unkempt, but undeniably alive, moving with a purpose that was not merely the furtive scuttling of a desperate scavenger. He carried a wooden bucket and began to walk, slowly, towards the village well. I watched him, frozen, my mind a maelstrom of conflicting impulses. Flee. Hide. Call out. The silence of our dead world had been so absolute for so long that the thought of shattering it with my own voice felt like a transgression, a profanity. And then, from another direction, from a cottage even further down the lane, a second figure appeared. A woman. Her form stooped, her movements slow, but she too was alive, carrying a bundle of what looked like firewood. She too was heading, hesitantly, towards the square. They saw each other at roughly the same moment. I fully registered them both. They stopped, perhaps 20 paces apart, the man with his bucket, the woman with her bundle. They simply stood, staring, as if seeing apparitions. The silence between them was vast, charged, filled with all the unspoken horrors they had each endured, all the losses, all the fear. I remained hidden, a breathless observer of this impossible reunion. Time seemed to stretch, to become as elastic and unreal as it had been during the worst days of the plague. And then, slowly, hesitantly, they began to move towards each other, not with the joyful rush of recognition one might expect from survivors of a shared catastrophe, but with an infinite, agonizing caution. Each step was measured, tentative. Their eyes, I could see even from my distance, were filled with a complex, unreadable mixture of emotions: disbelief, fear, a dawning, fragile hope, and an overwhelming, soul-deep weariness. They met in the center of what had once been the square. And they stopped again, a few feet apart, close enough to touch, yet separated by an invisible chasm of trauma and ingrained mistrust. The synopsis from your provided image perfectly captured this moment that I now witnessed in Geping. Kang bit nem he ki hesitant, not knowing whether to embrace or turn away. The man's hand, clutching the bucket, twitched. The woman's grip tightened on her bundle of sticks. I saw her lips move, though no sound reached me. Was it a name? A question? A prayer? For a long moment, nothing happened. They were statues, carved from grief and disbelief, silhouetted against the impossible blue of the spring sky. And in that moment, I felt the full, crushing weight of what we had lost, and the terrifying, precarious nature of what might, just might, be found again. To reach out, to touch another human being after so long, after so much death had passed between hands, it was an act that required a courage far greater, perhaps, than any act of solitary survival. Then, the man slowly, very slowly, lowered his bucket to the muddy ground. The woman let her bundle of sticks fall with a soft thud, and he took one hesitant step forward, then another. She did not move, but her head tilted, a bird-like gesture of questioning, of unbearable vulnerability. He reached out a hand, not to embrace, not yet, just an open hand, palm upwards, an offering, an invitation, a plea. It trembled. I could not breathe. The fate of our shattered world, it seemed, hung suspended in that small, trembling gesture. She looked at his hand for a long moment. Then, her own hand, thin and scarred, rose, equally hesitant, equally trembling, and touched his. Just a brushing of fingertips, a spark, a connection, a sob. A ragged, tearing sound escaped the woman, the first truly human sound, beyond the cawing of crows or the howl of the wind, that I had heard in what felt like a lifetime. And then they were in each other's arms, not in a joyful embrace, but clinging to each other as drowning souls cling to driftwood, their bodies racked with a grief too profound for tears, a relief too fragile for celebration. I watched them, and something within me, something I had thought long dead and buried under layers of ash and ice, began to thaw. It was not joy. Not yet. It was something far more complex, a painful, hesitant recognition of shared humanity, a terrifying glimpse of a future that might involve more than just solitary endurance. The sky above them, above us all, was a vast, indifferent, achingly beautiful blue. Spring had found the living. It had found them in the ruins of their world, amidst the graves of their loved ones, their souls scarred, their hearts heavy with an unbearable weight of memory. It had found them hesitant, broken, not knowing whether to embrace or to turn away. But they had embraced. I did not reveal myself then. The moment was too sacred, too fragile. Their reunion was theirs alone. But as I slipped away, back towards the quiet solitude of Alara's garden, the image of their clinging forms, silhouetted against that vast expanse of blue, remained. The plague had passed, the winter had broken, the silence had been shattered, not by a bell, but by a sob, by the touch of one human hand upon another. What lay ahead? I did not know. The path would be long, arduous, fraught with the ghosts of the past and the uncertainties of a world irrevocably changed. The village was a ruin. Our lives were in ruins. But the sky was blue, and two souls, amidst the devastation, had found the courage to reach out. Perhaps, just perhaps, that was enough. Perhaps that was a seed, as potent and as resilient as any Alara had planted, from which something new, something unimaginably precious, might one day begin to grow.